All right, we are live. Sorry about the slight delay there. We're having some internet issues. Eric's connection actually dropped out right before we were about to start, and I've had some issues myself today. So if you could all say a little prayer for us to have good internet connection during this, that would be great. We already did a prayer before we connected, so we'll just dive in. Today we're going to be looking at the reliability of the New Testament and in particular the book of Acts. Muslims tell us that the Bible has been corrupted, that the words have been changed and the meaning lost, that kind of thing. Atheists say something different, but ultimately similar. They often say that the authors of the Bible, and in particular the gospel writers, were writing theological works that were largely fictionalized, that they had minimal basis in history. Neither of these beliefs are generally based on any solid evidence. They're based on someone's desire for something to be true. They're based on what someone told them, but it's rarely based on any in-depth study of the evidence. Well, it turns out we can actually answer this question fairly objectively when we look at the work of history, whether it be something in the Bible or something outside the Bible. We can go to the work and we can apply various tests to see whether it is presenting reliable history, whether it's presenting unreliable history, that is, it's intending to say factual things, but the author is not very good at saying factual things, or whether it's intended to be a work that is fictional or, perhaps differently put, spiritualized, that's not making claims about objective reality. And when we do that, we're going to see that the New Testament, and in particular the work of Luke Acts, we'll be looking at Acts today, is extremely reliable. And this work holds up to scrutiny very well. I'm joined by Erik Manning from Testify. His channel has been absolutely blowing up lately. I actually, being a data nerd, keep statistics on a number of YouTube channels. There's about 600 channels in my database of Christian YouTube channels. And among the channels with over 2,000 subscribers, because the smaller your channel is, the easier it is to grow exponentially. Among channels with more than 2,000 subscribers, his channel actually was the second largest had the second largest percentage growth of any in the database during the month of August. And there's a reason his channel's blowing up, because he's doing amazing work. He's putting out really great content. So definitely check that out. And the fastest growing one, by the way, was the David Wood Archives. So that would happen to be my channel. So you got the two fastest growing creators right here on this stream. So you're in the right place. Erik, I'm going to give you a chance to say a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I got 5 kids. I'm living in Iowa, married with my wife here. And yeah, I've been interested in apologetics for probably the last 10 years or so. It started with a conversation in the lunchroom with some coworkers where I just didn't really have adequate answers. And so I just started to find out where could I find those answers, and just been kind of going down a big rabbit hole ever since. And so, but yeah, I've started the YouTube channel Testify been posting regularly since the beginning of January of last year. And now I got over 100 few videos, mostly focusing on reliability of the New Testament, the argument for miracles, which would also include some modern examples of miracles. And sometimes I'll get into other issues as well, but mostly those kinds of things. And so I just have always been really drawn to history. Even as a younger person in high school, I would get straight A's in my history test without having to study. I don't know why. Just kind of something that I was always interested in. And so I really definitely favor historical apologetics. So,
Excellent. So whenever I have a new guest on, one question I always like to ask everyone is, why are you a Christian?
Well, I became a Christian in my teenage years. I was actually spent a few years being an atheist. I was raised in the Catholic Church, and we were just kind of like nominally Catholic, didn't really go to Mass very often. And then I abandoned that as a teenager, mostly because of like the problem of evil and suffering and different things like that, as well as just I figured science had just more explanations than theology did. Um, but I eventually became more open to the existence of God. I just figured that not everything just came here to be for no reason and no purpose or no cause. And there's definitely a lot of design and beauty in nature. And I really think that my moral intuitions, I was kind of like a moral nihilist. I didn't think that there were moral facts when I was an atheist, but I came to view that that was a really counterintuitive thing. So even without hearing a lot of the philosophical stuff that, we apologists like to talk to now in a kind of a more nitty gritty, very detailed way, I kind of reasoned my way a bit towards God with, of course, the grace of God. I started reading the Bible, and I just read it and read it for months. There was parts about it I liked, and there was parts I didn't like. And there was parts that I just didn't understand. Like I'd come to the Gospels and I'd see all these miracles and different things that Jesus did, and I just thought that was probably not right. It didn't, because that wasn't my experience. Um, but eventually, and I'm summing up here, basically, um, I realized that they were really trying to tell us testimony. It didn't seem like they were, just they weren't these feel good parable stories of Jesus healing the sick. They seemed like they were really trying to report something, and so I had those kind of intuitions. But the real thing, everything changed when I eventually had like a religious experience with God, where I just sensed another presence in the room and felt conviction for my sin, and have been going in this direction for the last 22 or 23 years.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned that you kind of got interested in apologetics because you were already interested in history and got interested in the historical argument. But why did you take the step to start a YouTube channel? Because a lot of people are interested in this kind of thing, and then taking the step to make a public ministry, put yourself out there making videos, is quite a leap sometimes. So how did you get started with YouTube?
Sure. Well, as you could probably see from my hat here, I'm a bit of a baseball fan. You might be like, well, how in the world is that related? Well, I used to on the side, as like a side hustle, I was like a baseball blogger. I covered the St. Louis Cardinals and other teams blogging. I wrote for a website called Fangraphs. If there's any diehard baseball nerds out there, you know who Fangraphs is. This was like over 10 years ago. But anyways, I was really into that, and I just have always been given to writing. I always enjoyed writing. So when I got interested in apologetics, I thought, I'm going to write about apologetics. I'm going to start a blog about apologetics. And I think from there, I just progressed to, it just seems like where things are at, people don't want to just read a blog. They want to consume information in a video kind of format. That's just kind of where everything is headed. And so I kind of and I also felt just, to be honest, I just kind of felt prompted by what I believe was the Holy Spirit, but that I needed to go in this direction. And so yeah, it's why I started. I kind of went kicking and screaming against my will to start a channel at first, and thought, who's going to watch this? Who's going to listen to this? Who cares what I have to say? But then I realized that's exactly the same thing that I said about starting a blog too. I thought nobody's going to read this, but here we are. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, sometimes God calls those who seem least equipped to do something, almost like so he gets the glory or something.
Yeah.
I never would have ever imagined doing something public. I was always interested in apologetics, but public speaking, that's like as far from my personality as you can get. I'm the kind of introverted person who wants to read a book. I don't want to go out there and talk to people, but God had other plans. So here we are together today. Yeah. Last introductory question here. You kind of told us a little bit about what your channel does. You said that you deal some with the historical arguments, some arguments for miracles. But what you didn't mention is what your approach to doing apologetics are, because there's a number of different strategies. So how do you go about doing apologetics?
I'm a hardcore evidentialist. And so I think that you could go straight to arguing for um, what Jesus said and what Jesus did, namely the resurrection, and argue from there. I think that proves not just the existence of a generic God, but the Christian God. I think as long as the prior probability of God existing is not zero, I can swamp you with enough evidence where I think you should and could rationally believe. And so I don't have any problem with using classical um, arguments for the existence of God or anything else like that. I think those can be helpful. I'm more into the arguments that have maybe scientific premises that you can point to, because I think those are a little easier to grasp than just metaphysical ones. Although I know there's always a lot of overlap. Um, but yeah, I would definitely call myself a pretty hardcore evidentialist.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the historical argument myself. That's typically where I go first. And since my ministry is focused on outreach to Muslims, I generally don't have to argue for the existence of God
Yeah,
anyway.
exactly.
So the debate between Christians and Muslims is a little bit different than the debate between Christians and atheists.
Mhm.
Muslims are much more about, oh, the New Testament is unreliable. You can't believe what it has to say, which fits in perfectly with my pre-existing interest in that argument. So
Yep.
it was a good area for God to call me to.
Yep.
So we're going to be looking at the book of Acts today. I'll go ahead and put your presentation up on the screen here. If you have questions or comments from the audience, feel free to post those. I'll keep an eye on that. Otherwise, we'll dive right in.
All right. Now I'm loaded for bear here, so if we don't get through all of this, that's completely fine. And if you have any questions at any point or clarifying that you'd like, just let me know, Thaddeus. Um, and I also have a series of videos on the Book of Acts, and I'm probably working on maybe 2 or 3 more videos that I'd like to add to it, so folks can check those out as well. But yeah, Acts is just a wealth of awesome historical information. I absolutely love the Book of Acts. And the reason why I think it's important is that Luke and Acts come from the same writer. And there's very good evidence that from the we passages, that Luke traveled with Paul. So if Acts comes from a meticulous historian who seems to have firsthand knowledge of at least some of the life and doings of Paul, I just realized my cat is in here. If you heard him meow,
No worries. No worries.
this should
My cats
increase.
join the stream sometimes, so it's all good.
Yeah, this should increase Luke's credibility. Um, so Luke definitely states his commitment to factual truth in both of his prologues. He talks about interviewing many eyewitnesses and different things like that. Well, it's not exact words, but I'm kind of paraphrasing there. So if it could be demonstrated that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, it would be surprising if his understanding of the apostolic claim concerning the resurrection differed significantly from that of Paul. And I think this is really important because you'll often hear skeptics. I was just talking to Derek Lambert from Myth Vision. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but the other day he was talking about how hello, kitty. Anyway, he was talking about how Paul has a very different view of the resurrection. He seems to think that it's more of a. I'm going to crudely. If Derek sees this, he could beat me up later if he wants to. But it's kind of more of a Casper the Friendly Ghost kind of a thing, where it's physical, but it's not physical, and all that other kind of stuff. And obviously, Luke talks about eating fish with Jesus, them touching Jesus, them spending 40 days conversing with Jesus, that are very much different. And so I think this kind of takes that wedge out that people will try and drive between Luke and Paul.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, the claims about Paul, because you'll talk to 2 different skeptics and they'll give 2 opposite views. One will say, Paul didn't know about the historical Jesus. He didn't believe in a historical Jesus. He only believed in a spiritual Jesus. Then you'll talk to someone else and they'll be like, Paul didn't believe that Jesus was God. He was just only a human being. It's like those are completely opposite views. How are you getting completely opposite views from the writings of Paul? It's almost like, you're not actually looking at everything he has to say. You're only selecting out things that fit your view.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot of cherry picking that goes on out there. But anyways, the other thing with the importance of Acts is that he claims to be present with Paul during his visit to the Jerusalem church in Acts 21. And this is important because it says that all the elders, including James, were present. And so this means that Paul and Luke would have had access to interview people there at that point. He was also present with Paul during his imprisonment at Caesarea Maritima for at least a couple of years, which is only 75 miles away from Jerusalem. So it would have been just, not that long of a journey for Luke to go and talk to the disciples in Jerusalem, perhaps even Jesus' mother Mary, and get some of the information. So this helps us to establish that Luke was in a place, in a position to know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. I hadn't considered that, but Luke demonstrates that he had access. I mean, he makes the claim, obviously, in
Yeah.
the prologue, but then he also demonstrates that he has access indirectly. He doesn't claim, I was there, but we can infer that he was there because these wee passages where the book of Acts takes this odd turn from it goes describing things in third person to first person. And the only real explanation for that is the author is switching to his own firsthand knowledge at that point.
Yeah. We'll talk about that. There's definitely objections to that, and I'll get into a quote from Bart Ehrman here in a second. The other reason why Acts is important, I'll kind of breeze through this pretty quickly here. He provides the physical details surrounding Paul's conversion. So it's not just, what we see in Galatians where it's like, Paul is like, yeah, he revealed himself in me. No, Luke gives us the details about the other traveling companions who saw the light and heard the voice, and the following 3 days of blindness that was cured by Ananias. And he also differentiates the Paul's post-ascension visionary experience, which is very different than what the disciples experienced, which were these polymodal appearances that were extended across a period of 40 days, these multi-sensory experiences. And so that's why this is important. And so what are the evidences that we have for Luke being an unembellished author? And we're going to look at, we might not get to all of these, and that's totally fine. We might only get to like 3 or 4. But there are external confirmations, things that we can verify in history. There are undesigned coincidences. I'll describe what those are. If you have apologetics geeks watching, that some of them might already be familiar with that argument, some might not be. We'll talk about what the principle of restraint is. And then these others, artless similarities, reconcilable variations, unexplained illusions. We'll see if we can touch on them all. If we don't, again, that's totally fine. People can just go to my channel and see more. But so go ahead, Thaddeus. Were you going to say something?
Yeah. It might be in your presentation. I haven't seen the presentation, but I can tell you what the Muslim is going to say. Is they're going to say, "Oh, the author is anonymous. We don't know who wrote this book. That means you can't trust it." So maybe before getting into any of the other evidence, just does the fact that the book is technically anonymous, and maybe explain what that means, does that have any bearing on whether it is reliable or not?
Yeah, well, technically anonymous, I guess, but obviously Luke is writing to Theophilus, and we see that in his prologue, right? So this was probably a patron of his. If the book would have not been anonymous to him, there is a book or a paper written by, why am I drawing a blank on his name all of a sudden? I'll get the name here in just a second. But basically, he describes that there were a number of different ways that a writer could identify in like a seal on the roll or all kinds of different things to where it wouldn't have been anonymous. Also, I would refer people to Dr. Stephen Boyce's channel, Exploring Christianity. He's got like hours of videos on the anonymous
that he does.
where he just like kind of roasts the whole idea. But it's included in the Muratorian canon that Luke wrote Acts. That's where the tradition goes to. That was a document that was in the late 2nd century. While I know we would like to have earlier documents, we also have Tertullian mentions that Luke was the author. Clement of Alexandria mentions, I believe, if I remember correctly, that Luke was the author. Irenaeus certainly mentions that Luke was the author. Again, these are all early 1st century. Justin Martyr certainly quotes the Gospel of Luke, and he was writing in 150 AD. Justin Martyr had a student named Tatian. Um, and Tatian wrote a thing called the Diatessaron, which literally means through four, and it quotes all four of the Gospels. Justin Martyr says that these were to be read in churches, that they were uh, on par with Scripture. They should be read alongside with the prophets. And then you also have Polycarp, Ignatius, who also quote as authoritatively Luke and Acts. And so it's just like there's this chain of history from the very beginning where if Luke is not particularly mentioned, he's cited as authoritative. And I don't think that these guys would have been just kind of making these allusions if they didn't feel like these were getting these from authoritative sources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a word game, really, because you say the word anonymous and people think that means we don't know who the author is. But when it's used in a technical sense, it just means the author doesn't write within the body of the text, I am so and so and I'm writing this, which means just about all works are technically anonymous. And it's kind of a word game that people play. They're like, oh, well, we don't know who wrote it because it's technically anonymous. Well, that's not really true. We have very solid evidence of who wrote all the Gospels, I would say, but especially Mark and Luke. There's no reason why anyone would make up those authors. They're insignificant figures,
Yeah.
relatively speaking. And if you're going to make up an author, it's going to be one of the disciples for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just did a stream with Dr. Stephen Boyce on my friend Than's channel called Exploring Reality in a response to a critic. And he went through just all kinds of information. He's a wealth of information on canon and authorship. So if people want to check that out, they could get a ton more details. It's pretty overwhelming, the case that he gives. So
yeah, I agree. Before we move on, Villainous asked, who is Theophilus?
Well, I would say Theophilus is who the book is addressed to. It's I'm probably a patron of Luke's. He is writing so that he may be assured of the things that he was taught about Christianity are true, is what we read in the prologue. There's a lot more that we would like to know about him, but he's obviously a real person. Most people, I don't think that Theophilus is just some kind of literary device, although I have heard some people try to argue that. But it's to whom the book of Acts was addressed to assure that particular person that what he had been taught was historical, which again underscores the importance, I think, of historical apologetics. I mean, we have a gospel because of the need of discussing this kind of thing. So.
Yep, absolutely. I'll let you continue the presentation.
Okay, so Bart Ehrman, noted New Testament critic, every Muslim's favorite, until he talks about Jesus being crucified, of course. He says that the author of Acts is simply claiming to be a traveling companion of Paul's, so he thinks the weak passages are bunk. He says that they would be therefore unusually well suited to give a true account of Paul's message and mission, but he was not a companion of Paul's. On the one hand, he was writing long after Paul and his companions were dead. Scholars usually date Acts to around 85 CE or so, usually 2 decades after Paul's death. Well, I don't really see that as a big problem, even if it is dated that late. But I don't think that it is. We don't have to necessarily date Luke that late. I think there's good arguments that we could date it early. On the other hand, he seems to be far too poorly informed of Paul's theology and missionary activities. And I want to really focus on missionary activities. We're going to talk about that a lot, to have been someone with firsthand knowledge. And so let's see if Bart really has a point here. Here is a book that I would recommend people get a hold of. It's not a beginner level book at all, but it is written by a classical historian by the name of Colin J. Hemmer, called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And I believe it's chapter 4. He goes through 84 very difficult facts that Luke absolutely gets correct about the Greco-Roman world that aligns with Paul's travels. And so I'm going to go through a bunch of these now. Don't let your eyes glaze over too much here because some of this is like nitty gritty details, but we're going to go through a few examples here. Luke gets the proper designation. So local titles. Luke gets a lot of local titles, right? So he gets proper designation for the magistrates of the colony as strategoi, following the general term archontes in verse 19. He uses the proper term politarchs, used to the magistrates in Thessalonica. This is a particular term that was in this particular area. This isn't just like politarchs are everywhere. It's this particular area. It's a local term. The term Areopagites, which is derived from Areos Pagos, this is the correct title for a member of the court of Athens. He also correctly identifies Gallio as the proconsul, the resident of Corinth, an illusion that lets us date the events to the summer of 51 AD to the spring of 52 AD, and even liberal scholars accept this. This particular one, that's how they date when Corinthians was written. That's when Gallio served as the proconsul. Luke also uses the correct title Grammatos for the chief executive magistrate in Ephesus, which is found on many archaeological inscriptions that we have. When Luke tells us of the riot in Ephesus, he indicates that the city clerk told the crowd that there are proconsuls. Now, this is really interesting. A proconsul is a Roman authority to whom one might take a complaint. Normally, there was only one. So why does Luke so casually mention the plural term proconsuls and thripatoi here? Well, it turns out that just at that particular time in history, there was in fact two as the result of an assassination by poisoning of the previous proconsul Silanus in the fall of 54. So that's like really dead on, nitty gritty details that are, I would say, best explained by somebody who had like very thorough local knowledge, right? And there's also the fact that Luke refers to Publius, I may be pronouncing that wrong, as the first man of the island. This is over on Malta towards the end of the book. Inscriptional evidence confirms this is the correct title on Malta, first man of the island. So Malta's, it's not a huge place. Local beliefs and customs. Luke knows that there are two gods known to be associated with Lystra, Zeus and Hermes. These are actually paralleled epigraphically from Lystra itself, and the grouping of the names of Greek divinities is particularly characteristic of the Lystra district. So those were their gods right there in Lystra. Those are their two, I'm trying to think of the right word, but they're guys, right? The main gods out of all the gods they were into. Luke also used the correct Athenian slang word for Paul, the seed picker, when they're like, what is the seed picker talking about? That's what the Athenians said. That was one of their slang words. And so, as well as the court Hill of Ares, he gets that correct. The shrines and images of Artemis, terracotta images of Artemis are abound in the archaeological evidence. There's also the altar of the unknown god. This, again, is a local belief and custom that Luke is aware of. We actually find those altars mentioned in Pausanias and Diogenes, excuse me. And we also do have, I believe, some archaeological evidence that backs that up as well. Luke gets a ton of geography, sea routes, and landmarks right. The proper port Perga is the correct ship crossing from Cyprus. He names another proper port, Italia, that returning travelers would use. He correctly names the sailor's landmark, Samothrace. He gets the correct implication that sea travel, is the most convenient way of reaching Athens, with the favoring Etesian winds during the summer sailing season. He also gives a few disjointed allusions to the distance and direction of the storm-driven voyage from Cauda to Malta. We'll talk about that. But they work well enough to enable a sailor to reconstruct a logbook of the ship's course and speed. So tacking 8 points to the north, as close as the wind Euraculo, as was safe, would bring them 476 miles in a little over 13 days, assuming the rate of drifting at 1.5 miles an hour. And lo and behold, what we find out in Acts 27:27 is they arrived on the 14th night. And so this is like even sailing information and knowledge, like that comes in. And that's exactly when they arrived. So that's just kind of craziness right there. Let's talk about Cauda a little bit more, because I find this one to be really interesting. It says that in Acts 27:13, it says a moderate south wind came up. Supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before very long, rushed down from the island a violent wind called Euraculo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And when the ship was caught in it, they could not face the wind. And so they gave way to it and let themselves be driven along, as we just discussed. And running under shelter of a small island called Cauda or Clauda, Now, what's interesting about this is that Kata is more than 20 miles west-southwest where the storm likely struck the travelers in the Bay of Masara. This is precisely where the trajectory of the northeastern should have carried them. This isn't the sort of information that someone would have inferred without being carried there by the wind themselves. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The ancients found it nearly impossible to properly locate islands this far out. So, oops, I went backwards instead of forwards here. Ptolemy, he got it wrong. He was a geographer. Pliny the Elder, another historian who, did geography and whatnot. He was pretty well off in his approximations. Luke is the only historian who actually got the proper location correct. Well, this is of course best explained by the fact that Luke was actually there. Bart's here saying that the wee passage is like, yeah, he's just making that up. Well, again, like, this is one heck of a lie if it is, because he's getting so many of these things correct. And there's even more with this voyage and shipwreck of St. Paul. And there's an interesting book that people can get if they want to learn more about this. It's called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. It's by James Smith. It's actually out of print. It's public domain. It's pretty old, but you can download it for free on the Google Play Store. But Smith notes that the narrator of the voyage and shipwreck of Paul was not just an eyewitness; he was also a landsman. In several places, Luke gives an accurate account of the actions of the crew, but what he doesn't give a full account or any account why these actions are necessary. So he shows that like he's just kind of ignorant about sailing. And so, for example, in Acts 27:13. Luke says that after leaving Fair Havens, the ship sailed close to shore. While this passage demonstrates Luke's reliability as an observer, it shows that he was no sailor. The ship did not sail close to shore on purpose. They had no choice in the matter. Cape Matala lies 4 miles south by the west of Fair Havens, with the wind now coming from the south. Because ancient ships could not lie closer to the wind than 7 points, they would have had a struggle to keep the ship from being blown against the coast until finally rounding the cape. The phrase "chalisantes teskeos," I may be mispronouncing that. I don't speak Greek. That shows Luke's accuracy and observation that they were taking down all superfluous rigging, but his lack of appreciation of this navigational necessity of laying the ship on a starboard track with the right side pointed to the wind. And so he sees them doing these things, but he doesn't get why they're doing it. But he correctly notes what they would be doing. Casting anchors from the stern in Acts 27:29. That's actually the proper emergency action to take in such circumstances, preventing the ship from swinging around broadside to the waves and being smashed stern first on the rock. Luke reports the action without showing any awareness of how unusual it was or why it was necessary. And then also the fact that once they were trying to run the ship ashore at daylight, it was imperative for them to throw all remaining weight in order to have the best chance of running the ship bow first as high as possible on the beach. Again, Luke reports the action, but he gives neither the reason that the grain was retained earlier or why that they were now chucking it overboard. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So he's just like reporting all this stuff that you and I, if we were on a ship reporting this stuff, we'd be like, I don't understand what's doing, but he's reporting it. Yeah, and I actually already mentioned this, so I'll skip past that one. One more external confirmation. This one I find really interesting. This is in Acts 22:25 through 29. And it says, as they stretched out to flog Paul, Paul had been arrested and they were going to beat him. And Paul's like, wait a second. I'm a Roman citizen here. You can't just beat me, right? And the centurion heard this and he went to the commander and reported it. And they said, what are you going to do? This man is a Roman citizen. And the commander went to Paul and said, are you a Roman citizen? And Paul answered, I am. And the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. But Paul said, well, I was born a citizen. Well, this is interesting because the Roman commander is, first of all, surprised that Paul is a Roman citizen. And then he finds out this feature where he says, I had to pay a lot to become a citizen. Well, the sale of citizenship was a well-known feature during the reign of Claudius, the emperor. Dio Cassius records, this is a Roman historian, records that the cost of purchasing citizenship went down during the reign of Claudius. So at first it was like really, really expensive. And then Dio Cassius says that it went down so low that it was basically like you could buy Roman citizenship with like broken chunks of glass, basically. Colin Hemmer, the historian I mentioned earlier, says this man had presumably gained his rights early in the reign and had seen his pride reduced by Claudius's later practice, and this mark reflects this. And so, again, all of these particular details are just like somebody who is just very, very familiar with all of the different Roman customs, beliefs, the shipwreck, and all of this other stuff. And so, now there's the cat
Yeah,
again.
but before you go on here, and it looks like we're going to look at one of the ways that people respond based on your slide here. But I did have a couple comments from the
Sure.
audience that I wanted to take.
Yeah.
First, Ask Truth Apologetics says Acts does not mention the death of Paul. Paul was martyred somewhere around the year 62 to 64. It would stand to reason that Acts was written before Paul's death. And I am inclined to agree with this, not so much because it doesn't mention Paul's death, but because it just ends abruptly. And you need some sort of explanation for that. This is technically an argument from silence, which is never definitive, but it is still a valid piece of evidence. However, I would say that our case for the reliability of Acts doesn't depend on it being written in 62.
Mm-hmm.
It could be written in the year 85, like Ehrman claims, and still be reliable. The date is only minorly important at best. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would say that it's not really just an argument from silence. I would say that the death of Paul is really relevant, especially in a larger context concerning what the author was like, right? The author seems to have been following Paul's movements in detail towards the end of the book. And there's independent evidence that the pastoral epistles were actually written after Paul's first imprisonment, and the book ends with Paul's first imprisonment. So, and there's also the fact that the book was written for a particular individual, which we mentioned earlier, Theophilus. It's weird to think that the author would have just sat around with the book so long after its last recorded events and just wait 10, 20 years to just send it off to his intended recipient. And so that's not really an argument from silence. That's just an argument from the purpose of the book. And then Luke is very, very interested in court scenes. I mean, he mentions court scene after court scene after court scene after court scene in the book of Acts. And then all of a sudden, like the most important court scene, like we don't get anything about. And so that is slightly more of an argument from silence. But again, it goes back to what is the author of the book actually like? And so I think that is taken together a very good argument for the early dating of Luke. And then that Acts. And well, and the punchline there, of course, is that if Luke was written or Acts was written early, then Luke was written even earlier still. And we know that Luke depended on Mark. So that would make Mark even earlier as well. And so I think it's these kind of arguments that have pushed some scholars, and not even always conservative scholars. Adolf van Harnack was I believe, a 19th century scholar, German scholar. And this was one of the arguments that convinced him. And he was actually a very liberal scholar that Acts was written early.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is actually a pretty strong argument. And again, even if it's not definitive, you have to weigh the evidence. And there isn't really any evidence that it was written late, other than people's opinions about the author not understanding Paul's theology or something along those lines.
Right.
We've been going through all of these details, and you said that we're getting into the nitty gritty, and that's kind of the point, right? Because these are very minor things. These aren't kind of things that would just be common knowledge of people living in a different place, writing many years later. In fact, I would say they wouldn't even be common knowledge of people who were contemporary with when we believe that it was written. It seems that the author probably put a lot of effort into getting his details right.
Well, yeah, this is what it shows us, is that Luke is a very meticulous author. He's very scrupulous. And it also shows that he's close up to the facts. And so it gives us an idea of what the author is like. And then I think also the fact that if he was a traveling companion of Paul, Paul was persecuted. You have to think that Luke's life was not necessarily just all hunky-dory either. Like, he was in danger and laboring and traveling with Paul in awful circumstances, including a shipwreck. So it also tells us not just kind of the meticulousness of Luke, but also gives us this context of persecution that it really makes it more unlikely that he's just like making things up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple other comments from the audience, but I think I'll save those until after we go through this next part. And
Sure.
the main, generally skeptics will acknowledge the accuracy. They won't try to dispute what you just said. You'll say, yeah, you got all those things right. And then what they'll say is, big deal. That doesn't mean that the theology's right. Anyone can get details right. That doesn't mean that he's writing accurate history. And I know that you're about to address that, but I would just say preliminarily, well, it does mean something, because if you got those details wrong, you would tell us that we can't rely on them. So at very minimum, it increases the probability that he would be accurate on other things.
Correct. Yeah, I would agree. The Spider-Man fallacy is what they'll pull out. You'll often see skeptics like Apologia kind of talk back and forth with Apologia, kind of ribbed him the other day about the Spider-Man fallacy. But basically what the Spider-Man fallacy that skeptics will trot out is they'll just say that, like, this is the ever reliable Urban Dictionary giving us the definition here, saying that it's to illustrate the flaw in the assertion by evangelical Christians that archaeologists, for example, it could be other things like some of the other details that I gave here, unearthing biblical cities proves that the Bible was written by a supernatural force. Well, no, that's not really what we're saying. It's committed anytime the discovery of a mundane element, which is definitely stuff that I'm bringing out here, from what they're already assuming is a myth, legend, or story, is taken to mean that all the other parts of the story, even the supernatural, are also true. Looks like my screen is blocking out the true part where it says StreamYard is sharing my screen. But anyways, but what they're really doing, and what Tim McGrew, Christian apologist philosopher, has pointed out, is they're committing the Wikipedia fallacy. And like you just said, Thaddeus, it's kind of like a heads I win, tails you lose kind of thing, right? They'll often bring up, well, there's all these different historical errors and contradictions and different things like that. So that counts against the reliability of Luke. But if getting historical details wrong is evidence against the historical trustworthiness of Acts, for example, or the other Gospels, and then getting them right is got to be evidence for it here. Like there can't just be this asymmetry, you know? And so there's also the fact that these aren't just like, we know that Jerusalem is a real city, or we know that New York is a real city. You know, we're not saying it. These are very difficult, hard facts to get correct. And you have to remember that there was no Google back then. There was no Wikipedia, or even like the modern libraries as we know it. There's also the fact that highly realistic historical fiction was not a literary genre that existed yet. I've had some people bring up, well, what about like the apocryphal Gospels? And I'm like, well, thank you for bringing those up. For example, like the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, right? It's about the Apostle Thomas who allegedly goes to India, and there's a wedding going on, and there's King Gundusphorus, who is a real person in India. And that's kind of the extent of what you get. Stuff that would be very, very well known. There's not a lot of these little tiny details that would be difficult to get correct if they were probably not familiar with the area. Or I think it's just best explained with them being a traveling companion of Paul. Also, what exactly is so weird about Paul having a traveling companion that wrote down a travelogue of his journeys? Like, there's nothing miraculous about any of this. We know from Paul's letters, which critics do accept, that he definitely traveled and he definitely had traveling companions. So there's just nothing prima facie like weird about any of this. So, and again, the argument isn't just that like he recorded all these mundane things, therefore the miracle happened. No, I'm also bringing in the fact that it just shows that he's a meticulous person, writing in a context of persecution, which would make it more unlikely than not that he's just lying about stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the Gnostic Gospels, and it's great that these exist. We have a statement from probably a Muslim about those, which we'll get to in a little bit. But it's great that they exist because they provide contrast. They provide what an inauthentic source looks like. And as you mentioned, if you read any of these texts, you'll see that they're very lacking on details. I don't know. I don't think that you're going to discuss names because that's more relevant to the Gospels. But for example, you look at place names or people names, and you look at one of these Gnostic accounts, and they have like Jerusalem mentioned, and that's about it as far as place names, or people names. They refer to a lot of people as that guy or whatever, and they only seem to know the figures that the Gospels already know.
Mm.
Related, earlier Islam Menarta Overdad said, is there something as Quranic archaeology? Because Christians have biblical archaeology, it means history and archaeology prove the Bible. Do history and archaeology prove the Quran? Same idea there. The Quran is very vague. Well, first of all, it says very little about what was contemporary to Muhammad. There's very little about that. And then the biblical stories that it repeats are very vague. They could easily be details that were remembered from hearing oral tales of the story. So the long and short of it is, no, there really isn't any effort to prove the Quran through archaeology because there's nothing to investigate. There are none of these type of details. It can't be, a lot of things can't be proven wrong because they're so general that it'd practically be impossible to get that wrong. But at the same time, there's nothing to prove it right. So yes, these small details do matter. They show us the difference between someone who is writing something later and intending to pretend that it's an authentic gospel or authentic account of history, and someone who's writing contemporarily or near contemporarily and putting a lot of effort into getting all the details right, investigating matters, just like Luke claims to do in his prologue. He says that he spent a lot of effort in investigating the matter thoroughly, and interviewing those who would know. And the evidence bears that out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you want to, you can go ahead and continue, and we'll come back to the question about why the church got rid of the other gospels.
Oh boy, here we go. Well, I mean, I think we're kind of showing you why. And so, so undesigned coincidences. And if this is as far as we get, that's totally fine. It depends on how much time you got here. But I do want to definitely cover this. Undesigned coincidences, for those who don't know, it's sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from one another, or both, or were copied from a common source. So, for example, one book may mention in passing a detail that answers some question raised by the other in a very subtle and casual kind of way, and the two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So if I tell you, like, me and a friend, we had a discussion about a very serious situation about a friend of ours, and we decided to meet up at a minor league baseball game, right? And one friend comes and tells you about this particular discussion, and he said, yeah, we were at the game and like I got all this beer spilled on me, right? And then I come along and tell you, like, oh yeah, I was at the game the other day, and I almost caught a foul ball, but I was this close, but I just didn't quite get it. Somebody else got it. Well, if you think about those two details, I'm not mentioning anything about the beer being spilled on my friend. He didn't mention anything about the foul ball coming our way. But if you put those two together, they do go together. You know what I'm saying? Like, somebody in a tussle trying to get a foul ball, beer gets spilled and stuff like that. And so those two minor details, the subtle details, dovetail with one another, and they are markers of truth versus somebody trying to fictionalize something.
Yeah, and specifically not just markers of truth, but markers that the information comes from eyewitnesses. And, that doesn't necessarily mean the eyewitness is writing it down, but someone who is actually there. Because, you say you spilled a beer, to use your example, you cannot infer from that there was a foul ball. There's many reasons why you might have spilled a beer. So someone else writing an account later, if they were trying to come up with an explanation for the spilled beer, then they would certainly mention that the spilled beer. Likewise, because you can't infer that a beer was spilled just because there was a foul ball. So the subtlety is really important here, because it rules out the possibility of someone intentionally filling in details by writing a later account.
That's exactly right. And by the way, I don't drink beer. I'm a good Baptist. No, I'm just kidding. I'm actually not Baptist, but anyway, just thought I'd clarify that just in case. That we'll save the beer for the Catholics and the Presbyterians.
Well, you can change it to soda next time you use that example.
Yeah, there you go. So an example of these is, or do we need, like some people, this is 2 Corinthians 3, 1 through 2. Letters of recommendation to you or from you. You ourselves are a letter written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. And so this is just kind of a weird mention here, this kind of casual reference, like you talked about, the letters of recommendation. Where does that come from? Well, if you turn around to Acts 18:27, it says, when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, which Corinth is actually the capital of Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. So Apollos came there with a letter of recommendation, and you just kind of see, okay, um, these two just these accounts go very nicely together. Now, if there were only a small number of undesigned coincidences, something like this, we could absolutely shrug it off as statistical noise, or just say, well, maybe somebody wrote Apollos a letter of recommendation and just happenstance, big deal. So what? And that's true. I mean, even in a large box of jigsaw puzzle pieces taken at random, one piece from many different puzzles, someone with great patience might find pairs that fit together more or less by sheer accident. So that's true. But when a large number of pieces fit together, sometime in clusters, the chance explanation rapidly just becomes absolutely absurd. And that is why, to appreciate the force of the argument from undesigned coincidences, we have to have the patience to work through multiple examples. And this is where I think a lot of skeptics of the New Testament just kind of go off the rails. Is they'll pick out one or two of these and go, I can explain this. And it's like, no. Like, this is a cumulative case, right? Like, you can't just like explain one and think, I've beat the whole argument. You have to go through. It's like pieces of chainmail. Just because you can put one little chink in the armor doesn't mean that you've broken all of the other links that go together.
Yeah, exactly. That's really important here, because you're right. This is generally how this type of argument, but actually any evidence that we provide, is handled. Everything's viewed independently. It's like, well, yeah, I agree that you're not wrong about what you're saying, but that doesn't prove anything. And then you go to the next piece of evidence. Well, that doesn't prove anything. Well, they're technically right. Right? Each individual piece of evidence doesn't prove anything. But when you got tons of pieces of evidence, and on the one hand you have 50 different explanations for 50 different undesigned coincidences, and over here you have one explanation that the author was using an eyewitness account, then you got to look and say, well, which one of those is more probable? The 50 different explanations, or the simple fact they're using eyewitness testimony, which is hardly an extravagant claim, by the way.
Yeah, it becomes, like you said, very ad hoc. And one illustration I use is like, nobody wants to have COVID, you know what I mean? And so maybe nowadays people realize that it's not as big of a deal, but we'll stay out of that. But the point is like, if I had, let's just say I was short of breath, I could just be like, well, maybe the shortness of breath is explained by, I don't know, like, I didn't sleep that great the other night or something. I don't know. But then I also have a sore throat, and it's like, well, the other day I really was doing a lot of talking on the phone, and maybe that's why my throat is sore. And, and maybe I start to have chills, and it's like, well, the air conditioner is set at 68 right now. And so then I realize that later on I have a fever, and it's like, well, I guess I've been exerting myself while I'm washing the dishes or something. And you start to come up with all these multiple explanations. Just accept, I got one explanation that takes care of everything in one fell swoop. You probably have such and such disease, whether you want it to be true or not. Like, you're just going to have to suck it up and deal with it. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, let's look at a few more examples here. This one also deals with Apollos that I think kind of further drives the point home here. It says in 1 Corinthians 3, 4 through 6, it says, when one says, I follow Paul, another says, I follow Apollos, are you not being mere human beings? Or in other translations, Paul's just saying, you're carnal, you're being fleshy. And it says, what, after all, is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered, but God has been making it grow. And so this bears out with what we see actually in Acts, that early in Acts, it says that Apollos went to Corinth later, but Paul was actually at the beginning of the book of Acts. He was the one who was there first. We see that in Acts chapter 18. And so, Thaddeus, are you still there? You're frozen on me there. I'll just keep going. If not, it says we're still live, so I'll just keep going for the audience there. And so, if Paul was the one who planted and Apollos is the one that watered, then obviously Paul came first. And so this, again, dovetails quite nicely together. There's also the fact that in 1 Corinthians 1:14 through 17, it says, I thank God that I didn't baptize any of you but Crispus and Gaius. And then later on, he says that I wasn't speaking to you guys with wisdom and eloquence. Otherwise, the cross of Christ would be emptied of its power. And so what's with this like subtle kind of where Paul is almost a little bit defensive. He's like, hey, I'm not coming to you guys with wisdom and eloquence. Well, we just went over that Paul was chastising the Corinthians because they had their favorite preacher. One guy's like, well, Peter's my guy, and I like Paul, and I like Apollos, and all that other stuff. Well, we know that from Acts 18:24, it says that there was a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man who came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the scriptures. And so this, again, makes a lot of sense because here is Apollos, who is known for his eloquence, and at least some people in the Corinthian church were very taken up with how eloquent and how great of a public speaker Apollos was. And it even talks about how he was a debater in Acts chapter 18. And Paul, was more of a letters guy. He was a good writer, but when he was speaking, he wasn't as eloquent, and he had to rely more on the Holy Spirit is what he emphasizes. So again, these are just two things that just dovetail really nicely together. I'll just skip that part because that was the explanation that I just gave. This one I think is really, really interesting. This is 1 Corinthians 4:17, which says, for this reason I have sent to you Timothy. And so Timothy has already been sent. Timothy is on his way to see the church at Corinth while Paul is writing his letter to them over in Ephesus. And then in 1 Corinthians 16:10, it says, when Timothy comes. And so, hey, there you are. You're back. I was like, all right, well, I'm going to just keep going, I guess. But anyways, and then so he has sent them, but he's also saying they've already got his letter, but he's saying to still expect Timothy. So therefore, it's really simple to infer here that Timothy must have taken some kind of indirect route to Corinth. Now, most of the time, if you were going to write a letter from Ephesus to Corinth, you could just send it by ship. But, what we can see here is we can infer that Timothy probably took an indirect route, perhaps to check on the other churches on the way. And, well, I won't pull up the verses. I would encourage you all to check me out and verify if you want. We do see in Acts 19:21 through 22, and then later in 20, verses 2 through 4, that Timothy did, in fact, take up such a route, going up and around through Macedonia, and so there's no mention of Paul's letter or anything else like that. And so this one, again, is just neither one are copying from each other. It's pretty obvious, but they have all these little subtle casual details that are best explained with by Luke being a traveling companion of Paul. Another one here, we find out that that Paul was working. That was like his thing, he worked. He didn't often take up offerings or different things like that. And so he was working with Priscilla and Aquila. And it says that when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul actually quit working, it says basically, and that he devoted himself exclusively to preaching and teaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. So why all of a sudden does Paul go from working with Priscilla and Aquila to devoting himself full time to preaching? Well, if we're just reading Acts, we have no idea. But what we do see in 2 Corinthians 11:7 through 9 is that, and I'll just read the highlighted portion of the passages. It says that the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. And he's talking in the context of like, hey, I'm not taking a bunch of offerings from you guys. I'm not in this for the money. I'm in this because I'm trying to help you. And then he talks about that he didn't want to be a burden to anyone, and he wasn't a burden to anyone. He was able to provide out of his for his own means because of what people from Macedonia came and supplied what they needed. And we also know from reading Philippians, Philippi is in Macedonia, that he said that nobody else shared about giving and receiving except for you guys alone. And so that's where the offering actually came from. And so again, these two just go hand in hand in such a way that they're not copying from each other, and they're just these subtle interlocking details. Here's another one I think is really interesting. Is this is describing Timothy, and it says how from a childhood you've been acquainted with the sacred writings, for which you are able to make wise for you salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. And then also at the beginning of 2 Timothy, Luke talks about his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois, or I may have those mixed up. And it says that he had learned the scriptures from them from when he was a child, but there's no mention of the father. Well, obviously this is a reference to the Jewish scriptures that Paul is talking about with Timothy, but he doesn't give us any clue as to Timothy, who wasn't circumcised until only after his conversion as a young man, had acquired such knowledge. But then we come to Acts chapter 16, verse 1, and it says that when Paul came to Derbe and then Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish, but they're not even named here. The grandma's not in here. And, it says they were a believer, but his father was Greek. So apparently, that's the no scissors there. Timothy's Greek dad drew the line at circumcision, but allowed his mother to raise him as a Jew. But neither of these, the little details are kind of like, you have to put them together to see the whole picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll do one more.
Okay.
Acts 15:37 through 41 says that there was a sharp agreement that Paul and Barnabas parted companies because there was such a sharp disagreement between the two. They got in a big fight, right? And we see that Barnabas took Mark with him, and that was what the disagreement was about. It was because Mark, I guess, left them in the middle of things got a little tough. Mark bailed on him, and Paul's like, no, he is not coming. So what's this deal with Barnabas stumping so hard for Mark? Well, if we turn around to Colossians 4:10, we find out that Mark was actually the cousin of Barnabas. Well, now it's like, aha, well, that makes a lot of sense. Why Barnabas was stumping for his boy Mark is because they were related. They were cousins. And so, but again, you don't see this in Acts, and we don't hear about the fight at all in Colossians. It's only when you put them together that the full picture emerges. So those are undesigned coincidences, and I see we've hit an hour mark, so we could pause here for a second if you want to take any. Do you have any questions, or you want to take any questions? And
well, first I just want to emphasize that the skeptic here has a significant problem, because they basically have two choices. Other than that, Luke was an eyewitness, or the author of Acts was an eyewitness. They have two other choices. One is that all this just happened at random, that we're seeing patterns that don't exist, we're cherry picking, whatever, something along those lines. The other is that the author was familiar with Paul's letters and used those as a source, and still did it in a subtle way, which isn't that probable to begin with, but that's a massive problem, because their evidence that this is late is that the author is not familiar with Paul's work. I've heard an argument as stupid as the author of Acts is so unfamiliar with Paul, it doesn't even know that he wrote letters. And I'm like, well, that actually shows he's early, because if he was writing late, he would know that the letters became important, and he would mention those. But he doesn't know that they're important because they haven't become canon probably at the time he's writing, and he doesn't mention them. So they have a problem here. Either he's familiar with the material, in which case their whole argument for being late disappears, or they have to say, all these things are just lucky guesses, or it just happened by chance, which defies common sense. So I think they're in a real pickle.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of reasons to think that Luke was absolutely not dependent on Paul's letters. 2 Corinthians, there's Titus. He is mentioned like over and over and over again, and we see Titus mentioned in the Pauline letters elsewhere. Yet in the book of Acts, he doesn't appear even once. And so it's just kind of like you would think that if he was using Paul's letters, a fabricator could make a lot more material out of this. Yet in real historical documents, the omission of some person or event that we could hardly imagine ourselves omitting is actually really common. There's also the fact that Paul talks about all of his different sufferings. 3 times he was beaten with rods, but we only hear about one of those times in Acts. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A day and night I was adrift at sea. I mean, talk about an opportunity to make up some stories. And yet, not any of those shipwrecks are actually mentioned. It's only the disastrous voyage in Acts 27, which takes place years after the letter was penned. Do we get that? And then there's also the fact that, like, all the problems. I mean, think about all the problems in the Church of Corinth regarding marriage and food sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality and different things like that. It would be wholly natural if these would, find their way into the book of Acts. And yet the only time we see anything about any of that is like the question of food offered to idols. And Paul's advice to the Corinthians is actually less strict than the what the Jerusalem Council actually commands. He's actually a little more loosey goosey. He kind of focuses more on like their motives of eating and different things like that. And to the point where even skeptics sometimes will bring it up as a contradiction, which brings up another important point is that like for example, like Acts 9:25 through 20 or 23 to 25, it talks about how the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching it the nights, day and night, so they could kill him, but the disciples took him down by night through an opening of the wall, lowering him in a basket. Okay, so it's the Jews in Acts. But when Paul's writing to the Corinthians, he says, well, the governor under King in Damascus, the governor under King Aretas guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me. So he's blaming King Aretas, but I was let down through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. Now, I don't think that these two things are really hard to reconcile. I mean, kind of like what one does by authority, the other does kind of thing, but at the same time, like, why wouldn't Luke smooth these things out? Why would he introduce, these tensions and different things like that if he was really drawing from the Pauline letters?
Yeah, they'll use things like this as evidence that Acts is not reliable, and then they'll tell us that Acts copied from these letters, and it's kind of just it's really often very post hoc. They just pick and choose whatever explanation for one passage, and don't realize that they have contradictory explanations for different pieces of evidence. And again, that explanation might work for that particular passage, but you got to look at everything together. If you're just looking at an individual piece of evidence, you can probably come up with any explanation you want, but you got to look at everything. And when you look at everything, you got to, on the one hand, you got the simple explanation that the author of Acts was familiar with what happened in history versus, 10 different explanations, some of which are contradicting one another on the other hand.
Yeah, I mean, at one moment they want to say that like Luke was really careful and he was really devious and he was getting all these things right, and then on the other hand they want to say he's just a bungler and he can't get his facts straight and he's a goofus, and so it's just like, like pick one, like, you're going back and forth here. And so, yeah, I would say that it's definitely better explained on the fact that he's an honest and reliable and scrupulous reporter who just was close up to the facts that he's reporting. And if he's reporting these facts and he is really a traveling companion of Paul, then he's in a place to investigate about the other things like the resurrection appearances that we talked about, the other miracles of Paul and different things like that. And he's reporting these things as this is what's originally coming from the disciples. And we know about the context of persecution and different things like that. And so I think the best explanation is that Luke is telling us the truth.
Yeah, definitely. Just so you know, I don't have any other things on my calendar for today, so we can go as long as you want. I often have streams that are 2 hours or 3 hours, so we can do as much as you want. But before we go any further, I want to make a couple other points. You also mentioned that the book of Acts doesn't talk about any of these controversies that Paul is addressing in his letters, kind of as evidence that the author wasn't reliant on these letters. This also applies to the Gospels in general, that they don't, and this is actually kind of a different argument, that they don't take any of these controversies that they could solve by inventing words for Jesus,
Yeah.
And they don't take any of those things and project them back onto Jesus. All the things that Paul talks about being conflicts in the church, none of them have explanations. At least not any direct explanations in the words of Jesus. Kind of like the gospel authors. A lot of people think that people generally think that they're written at least after the earliest letters of Paul. And I think they're roughly contemporary, but regardless of how you do the timeline, they were certainly familiar with these controversies. Whether they're familiar with Paul's writings or not, they're familiar with the controversies. And they're not taking these controversies and solving them by coming up with words for Jesus. And you say, well, what? Who cares? What does that prove? Well, it proves that they're trying to be genuine. They're not trying to invent something. It doesn't necessarily prove that they're accurate about everything, but it does rule out the possibility that they're intentionally writing something fictional to solve theological problems, which is generally how skeptics approach the New Testament writings. Whenever they see a difference between two accounts, they say, oh, well, here, we could tell this about this author's theology because they made this change for this reason, kind of deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that actually ties really well to my next point. They definitely show an enormous amount of restraint. So, like, just kind of an example that you're giving ties in somewhat here. There's baptism, right? Nowhere in Luke's gospel is it mentioned that Jesus and his disciples baptized. We do read about it in John chapter 4. And Luke doesn't even contain the commission to baptize, like we see in Matthew 28:19, in the Great Commission, or the longer ending of Mark, we see the command of baptism, right? So if Luke really felt free to add incidents and put words into Jesus's mouth, it would have been really natural for him to add a reference to the importance on the part of Jesus's disciples. And yet that's exactly what we don't see, right? And so this is more evidence, I would say, for an unembellished author, right? Now, here's one where I think Luke could really throw a whammy on us, What about Jesus's appearance to Peter? Luke mentions it briefly in 24:34, and we know that it's talked about. It's in the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and we know that Luke was obviously forgiven by the time we get to Acts. We can only conjecture about how it came that Peter made it known that he had seen Jesus after his resurrection. But the original private meeting apparently wasn't available for publication. And so withholding details from a private conversation is something that we know happens all the time in real life. But if the gospel writers were, felt free to invent dialogues and scenes in order to fill out missing information, this would be exactly where we would expect to see it. And so I think this kind of restraint indicates that they're truthful authors. You know what I'm saying? And so that's just kind of the principle of restraint there, which really ties in with what you were saying. There's a lot of things that the gospel writers could have added to resolve some of the theological controversies of that particular time, like circumcision or something like that. But that is precisely what we don't see. And so yeah. Artless similarities. This is another line of evidence. And so basically, here's a critic. This is Uda Ranki Heinemann. She says that in Acts and the epistles, there are two Pauls. She says there's the historical Paul of the authentic epistles. She's probably referring to the 7 epistles, not the 13, like Romans, Philemon, 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, and so forth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And then there's the legendary Paul of Acts. So she thinks they're like two totally different people. They're very, very, very different. And I'm like, well, I don't see differences. I see a lot of similarities, and I see the similarities similar with undesigned coincidences in the sense that they're very artless. They're very casual. They don't look like they're embellished or like they're trying to do this on purpose. And so this is a quote from Lydia McGrew here. She says that while reading the Gospels and Acts, you'll notice similarities between the characters portrayed across different stories. Parallels between the Gospels concerning character depictions are unlikely to be the result of mere chance, and these correspondences are so casual and subtle that it's unlikely that they were designed that way. So let's look at some of the characteristics about Paul. Paul in the book of Acts is really touchy, sensitive about money. He's like, I haven't coveted anyone's silver or gold or clothing. You know that I worked with my own hands to provide for my own needs, right? And that's a big deal to him. Well, if we turn around in the book of Acts, or not the book of Acts, in his letters, Well, this is a constant theme that he's bringing up. To the Thessalonians, he's like, hey, I worked with my own hands. I did all this stuff. Which, by the way, we only find out what Paul did for a living in Acts, which is making tents. That's not even in the Pauline epistles, right? But Paul talks to the Corinthians, and he's talking about we labor, we work with our own hands. Even though, like, I have these rights that I could receive offerings and be supported full time and all that other stuff, he's like, I would rather die. Paul's really dramatic here. He's like, I'd rather die than take y'all's money, and so he's kind of like the anti-prosperity gospel preacher here almost. He's just like, no, this is what I'm doing, and nobody's going to deprive me of this particular boast. So he's really showing like the same touchiness about money that we see in the book of Acts. Well, again, this is best explained by somebody who was traveling around with Paul and knew the guy. Paul is a bit of a guilt tripper. So when he's talking and he's saying goodbye to the elders in Acts chapter 20, he says that you're never going to see my face again. And they're all weeping and crying and all that other stuff there. So he's just kind of laying it on a little bit thick, and he's a little bit dramatic, kind of guilt tripping them and saying, do all the things that I'm saying because you're never going to see my face again. And there's a lot of emotion going on. And then when he's writing to Philemon and he's trying to be like, hey, you should probably free Onesimus. And I know he ran away and I know he was a terrible slave and he shouldn't have done that. But I've met him in prison and he's been converted and he's my son now. And I'm sending him back to you. But this is what I want you to do. And by the way, you kind of owe me your life. Like he's just, again, laying it on really thick, laying it on really heavy in order to persuade Onesimus Philemon to do the right thing. And so there's also Paul's sarcasm. I love this one. Paul is just like a sarcastic and sassy guy. And this ties actually into another external confirmation. So Paul is before the Sanhedrin and he says something that they didn't like and he gets smacked across the face. And Paul's response is, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit and judge me according to the law, and command me to be struck against, contrary to Moses' law. And those who stood by him said, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, oh, well, I didn't know he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. And if you read this just kind of like black and white, you might not catch the sarcasm that Paul is laying it on, but he's actually laying it on really thick. And it also raises an interesting question, like, why did Paul not know who the high priest was? Well, actually, if we read Josephus, we find out that Ananias was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the high priest when Felix's predecessor, Quadratus, was the president of Syria. This historian Josephus tells us that Quadratus bound Ananias and sent him to Rome. This was so he could give an account to Claudius Caesar over doing some shady business. Agrippa actually interceded for Ananias, and he was able to return to Jerusalem. But Ananias wasn't actually restored to his former office of high priest. Instead, what happened is Jonathan succeeded Ananias. And we know this because Josephus refers to Jonathan occupying the office of the high priest during Felix's reign. This implies an interruption in Ananias' high priesthood. But Josephus tells us that assassins killed Jonathan in the temple. And so basically, like, he wasn't even really given the proper authority of high priest at that particular moment. He was just acting at it. And so after Jonathan's death, the office of the high priest remained unoccupied for some time. Eventually, King Agrippa appointed Ismail, the son of Phabi, to be the high priest. The events in Acts 23 took high priest during this interval. Ananias was in Jerusalem and the office of the high priest had remained vacant. So by his own authority, Ananias acted and he just assumed the role of high priest again. And so he's not even really legit. He's not even really official. And so this just very casually and subtly explains why Paul gets a little snarky and says, well, I didn't know he was the high priest, because the pretext is that he's not. And so this highlights not only Paul's sarcasm and kind of the same kind of the person that he was, but also it's another historical confirmation. Well, we see the same kind of sarcasm in Paul's letters. When the Galatians were being troubled by the Judaizers, he was like, hey, don't just stop at the foreskin, guys. Why don't you just why don't you just go all the way? Again, that's some pretty heavy sarcasm by Paul. And if you ever read like the end of 2 Corinthians, like it's just dripping with sarcasm. And so Paul is just a very sarcastic guy. Um, there's one more here. We know that Paul, one of the things that he tried to do is he tried to adapt to his audience. He said, I become all things to all men. To the Jew, I become a Jew. To those under the law, I become like one under the law, so that I may win those under the law. Um, and so to those who are without the law, I become like them, even though I'm not free from God's law, but under Christ's law, so as to win those who having not the law. I become all things to all men, so that, by any means I might win some. Well, we actually see this demonstrated in the book of Acts during some of the Paul's kind of court appearances. Like, for example, in Acts 22, he says that he speaks when Paul's talking and he's addressing a very Jewish crowd. He talks about the law of our ancestors, right? He says that he's just as zealous for God as any of them are. He describes Ananias as a devout observer of the law. Ananias, who had prayed for him and healed, the scales came off his eyes. He doesn't call him a Christian. He says that he's a devout observer of the law and highly respected by the Jews, right? And he holds out as long as humanly possible before he even drops the G word and talks about him going to the Gentiles, right? And so he's really trying to talk to them like they're Jews. But then when we see Paul before Agrippa, he calls the Jews his accusers and adversaries. Suddenly the Jews are the bad guys, the ones that are always causing Agrippa all of his trouble. He calls Christians in Damascus saints. He talks about forcing Christians to blaspheme, which this self-blame is something that also we see in Paul's letters. He's always blaming himself, like in Philippians, about how I persecuted the church and different things like that. He makes no mention of Ananias because why is Agrippa going to care about some random Jewish Christian? And he doesn't delay discussing or disguise his mission to the Gentiles at all. He's like super upfront about his mission to the Gentiles. And he mentions to Agrippa that when he was on the road to Damascus, the voice spoke to him in Aramaic, presumably because he's now speaking Greek to a Greek-speaking audience. And so it's these little touches that I think are best explained by Luke having accurate access to what Paul actually said and being very careful to record it. And it also fits in line with Paul's personality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a really solid piece of evidence that the author of Acts was familiar with the person of Paul, was familiar with his personality, had firsthand experience, because we can see these similarities in how he's portrayed, but they're not the kind of things that are very overt. It's not the kind of things that someone could just be hearing about what Paul did and reporting on, say, major events in his life.
Right.
Well, if someone's doing that, you say, well, maybe, lots of people probably had that knowledge. But how many people had, this intimate knowledge of his character? And it's not like he's going, and furthermore, it's not like the author of Acts is saying Paul regularly adapted his message to his audience or something like that. Like, he's not telling us that. He's demonstrating it unintentionally, I would say, right? That he's reporting information, but he's not trying to tell us this information about Paul. He's telling us the information about the historical events he's describing. And we see that in the process of doing that, we're seeing these personality traits, not something that someone would be likely to fake.
Yeah, exactly. And the upshot of this too is that if Luke is being careful to report Paul's speeches and try and get them correct, then he's probably trying to do how much more so with Jesus, you know what I'm saying? And trying to get the facts right of what Jesus actually said. And so, again, these are little things, but the thing about these arguments is it's kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts. You know what I mean? It's a cumulative thing. So,
before you go on, well, first, two questions. One legitimate question from someone in the chat, and one question that I know that Muslims seeing this would say. That passage you quoted from Paul in 1 Corinthians is one of their favorite passages of Paul's, because he says, I'm all things to all people. And they say, see, Paul was just making up lies. He was just saying whatever he needed to say to get his message across. So how would you respond to that accusation?
I mean, I guess I just don't see that. I mean, there's nowhere where Paul is like saying like, just making things up as he goes along. He actually seems to be pretty careful in separating, like, hey, this is actually my advice, and then this is actually like the Lord speaking. And like we see that in First Corinthians chapter 7, for example, where he's giving advice on like marriage and different things like that. And so he's very careful to say, like, this is my advice. Now, this is actually what the Lord says. And then when you look at it, it's actually in line with like what Jesus taught about marriage, that we see in like Mark chapter 10 and different things like that. And so, no, I think he's pretty careful to kind of differentiate that quite a bit. All he's saying is basically like, I'm just trying to relate to the audience that I'm speaking to in order that I may win some. It doesn't follow from there that I'm just like pulling stuff up out of my ear just to, say whatever I can to convert you. That's just kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. This is basically just what any good speaker would do. You
Yeah.
adapt your material to the audience in such a way that they'll understand it, but that doesn't mean you change your argument. Since you've talked a lot about baseball, if you're talking to a audience of sports fans, you might draw analogies with sports. But if you're talking to a group of people who have zero interest in sports, you're not going to use those same analogies when you're giving a presentation on some other material. That doesn't mean that you've changed your message. It just means that you've become like the audience. Or a different way that you could do this is, you're speaking to an audience that knows, say, Greek. Well, you speak Greek. You don't speak to them in Hebrew. You're speaking to an audience who's more comfortable speaking Hebrew. You speak Hebrew. I become a Hebrew to the Hebrews and a Greek to the Greeks. That doesn't mean that I've changed my message. It
Yeah.
just means that I've adapted the way I present it, which is what Paul's actually saying in context.
Yep. For sure.
So the question we have from Redouan Abdullah, who wrote the stories of Josephus and Ananias? I asked him I said he seemed confused since we're not thinking about stories of Josephus and
Yeah.
Ananias. But
Yep.
he did say that he was confused, and that he would like clarification with original proof. So maybe could you explain the nature of this argument? I think he just came in. He probably hasn't heard everything we've said. So maybe could you briefly explain the nature of your argument you're making, and then clarify who Josephus is and who Ananias is?
Sure. Well, Josephus is a first century Jewish historian, where we get a wealth of information of the Jewish world in the first century. He tells us a lot about certain biblical characters, one, of course, being Ananias. And he lets us know about the context of like the high priesthood with Ananias and how he was there, it was taken away from him, and how he reassumes the priesthood without the proper permission from the Roman authorities. And that's why Paul was being a little snarky with him, was he was just basically like, you're just basically a usurper. And so what I'm saying is that it dovetails, just like with the undesigned coincidences. It's this subtle, casual thing that actually dovetails with other information that we find in another source. This time being, instead of like between the letters of Paul and the Book of Acts, it's between the Book of Acts and Josephus, the Jewish historian. And so it confirms that Luke was in a place to know that Josephus kind of corroborates the same information, and the two bits of information just fit very well together. So yeah, that's basically it in a nutshell.
Yeah, so, to directly answer the question, we were talking about what Josephus wrote about Ananias and how that is congruent with what Acts writes about Ananias.
Correct.
So, our proof of what Josephus wrote is Josephus's writing. I think that you're not approaching, and like I said, I understand you just came in, you haven't been paying attention all this time, so you don't understand the nature of the argument. We're not saying that any piece of evidence is, absolute proof. What we're saying is all of this evidence is consistent with the hypothesis that Acts is reporting accurate history, and it's not consistent with the hypothesis that the author just made up this material.
Right. And I have this up here. I mean, it's like a cumulative case, and this is as mathy as I'll get. And I apologize for people for bringing in Bayes' theorem and different things like that. You might say, well, this is just a bunch of like weak arguments, and a bunch of weak arguments don't make a strong argument. You'll sometimes hear that, right? Well, suppose that the probability of the hypothesis that we're giving, like for all of these different things, is just like, 0.2, right? But to explain it away on like some other hypothesis, like Luke just was making something up and he happened to get lucky, or Luke was copying Josephus. That's another one, okay, which is an absolutely ridiculous hypothesis. But let's just say the probability of that is not zero. Let's just say it's 0.1, right? Well, then the ratio that we would have between the hypothesis that I'm presenting versus, its falsehood would be 2-to-1. So the way that cumulative cases work, well, if you get 10 pieces of independent evidence, that would actually have a cumulative power of 1,000-to-1. In other words, what I'm saying is 1,000 times more likely on all of these together than the alternate hypothesis. And so the point is that these small pieces of evidence, while no single piece of itself is of great weight, can combine to make a massive cumulative case. And so, yeah, that's a lot of times people don't kind of understand that, maybe because people don't intuit this as well as they should, because there's always a way out, right? But it seems like often it's the case that the way out, the other explanation just doesn't quite work as well. So even if you think mine is weak, but maybe just a little bit better than the alternative hypothesis, but there can be an alternative hypothesis, that doesn't mean it's like, okay, well, an alternative hypothesis can be made, so whatever, who cares what you have to say? Well, possibility does not equal probability. And then when you have a bunch of these together, they just snowball, where again, like we talked about earlier, I have one hypothesis that explains all the data with one fell swoop. So that's where we are.
Yeah, and I understand that this isn't always very easy for people to grasp the nature of the argument, but for people who are familiar with probability, which I agree is not going to be a large percentage of the population, but this is actually how any argument is going to be built. The times when you can have A, B, therefore C is very rare. You're going to have, I have 10 pieces of evidence. A good way to think of it that people are familiar with is building a case in court, right? You have someone who's accused of a crime, and you have evidence X, Y, and Z that they did it. They present evidence A, B, and C that they did it, and you have to weigh the evidence. You have to look at which is the more probable explanation of this evidence. You rarely are going to have absolute proof, Well, maybe you have a video recording of the guy committing the crime. Well, okay, maybe then you have absolute proof. But the majority of the time, you'll have some eyewitnesses who think that they probably saw him there. But, people can be mistaken. And then you'll have a different eyewitness that says, no, I was having dinner with him at that time. And you have to say, well, which of these eyewitnesses is more likely to be accurate? So it's that kind of idea. This is how you analyze any hypothesis, and this is especially how history is done, because we don't have video recordings of ancient history, and people have this misconception that history is proven by archaeology. We get a tiny bit of historical knowledge from archaeology, but most of our knowledge comes from written documents. So this is what historians do all the time: is they analyze documents, they see what the author said. They don't assume that the author's wrong, but they don't assume the author's right. They just look at it and weigh the evidence and say, well, generally speaking, someone's going to be right more often than they're wrong, unless they're intentionally making stuff up. So unless we have good evidence to the contrary, we can probably assume that this person's true. Then you look at 10 things that the author claims, and while you find 9 of them are false, well, you say, okay, he doesn't have any clue what he's talking about. I'm throwing this source out. You look at it and you say, okay, well, he's right on 9 of the 10 things. I can probably trust him on other things. That doesn't prove that every single thing he says is 100% accurate, but you're weighing the probabilities. And that's what we're doing with the case for the gospel, or in this case, the book of Acts, the case for Christianity. We look at all the evidence. We say which hypothesis best explains this data, and if the only explanation you have on the Bible is wrong side is, well, this for this and that for that and that for that and that for that. You have 20 different things, and each one, even if each one is 50% probably, 50-50 chance, coin flip, you don't know one way or another which is correct. Well, the chances of all of those explanations being correct is extremely small. On the other side, you have the explanation that the gospel or book of Acts is reliable. And, you say, well, I'm 50-50 on that. Well, you got a 50% chance that that's true. And then on the other side, you have a 1% explanation. Well, that means you got 50 times more likely that it is true than false. So hopefully that clears up the nature of this argument. And I'll also say to Redouan Abdullah, you also have, for you personally, I'm assuming you're a Muslim, you also have to weigh the evidence for and against Islam. If Islam is true, then you're right. It doesn't matter how improbable the explanations for how the gospel became corrupted are, then they still must have happened because Islam is true. But you actually have to have positive evidence for Islam, and you'll find that you can't make these kind of arguments when you go to the Islamic sources. If you go to the Quran, it's very vague. If you go to the Hadith or the Sirah or the histories, they have lots of details that all contradict each other. And indeed, some of them are provable ahistorical things, that they talk about events that happened 200 years after the time where they are placed based on other sources. So then your explanation is, all of these other sources are wrong and the Quran somehow got it right, or the Hadith got it right, or that the Quran is wrong and all of these other sources at least are partially true. So same idea. Maybe no single piece of evidence is 100% proof, although I would say there actually are a couple 100% proofs that the Quran is false, but that's neither here nor there. Even if no evidence by itself is 100% definitive, you got to look at everything weighed together. He also said that Luke copied everyone, which is just an assertion.
Yeah. Not only is it assertion, it's something that we've directly contradicted and showed why that's false. Redouan, do better. I'm sorry, buddy.
Yeah, and I mean, this was specifically said in the context of you saying that it was ridiculous, the idea that Luke copied Josephus. Well, there's a reason that hypothesis is ridiculous, and that's because Josephus was written around in the 90s, I believe.
90s, yeah. Not only that, but there's also the fact that skeptics will often bring up that Luke bungled the whole thing with the census, and the mention of Thaddeus. Is it Thaddeus? Might be. There's a zealot. There's somebody, false prophet or something, that Gamaliel is talking about in Luke chapter 5, and they'll say, we'll see, Luke got this particular fact right. Now, I think there's good explanations for both of those regarding the census and the other one that I just mentioned, to where there's actually not really a historical error or something like that. But if it were the case that Luke was drawing from Josephus, again, he would have smoothed those things out and made the material probably match a whole lot closer. I've actually had Jesus mythicists ridiculously argue. I've heard them say that, Luke intentionally was contradicting Josephus there, but he was copying him on all the other spots. And it's just okay, your hypothesis can't possibly be proven wrong at this point. It's just stretches as far as you want it to go, which is, again, absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, that we won't get into it because it's such an obscure, idiotic theory. But the idea that Luke copied Josephus has been seriously proposed, and it's based on basically zero evidence whatsoever, just the scholar's complete imagination. A couple more comments from Redouan. Evidence for Islam is Creator himself, the angels, and men of wisdom. So Redouan, that is a statement of faith. That is not a objective statement. We're looking at objective evidence, things that you can actually test. You are just asserting, basically, I believe that Islam is true because it comes from the Creator, therefore Islam is true. That is not an argument. And then Redawan also said Gnostic stories is wrong. Quran copied none of the Gnostic false stories. I think this is intended to be a continuation where Luke comes from. So first of
Well,
all,
okay, hold on. Redwan, stop. Put whatever you're smoking down for a second. No, I'm joking. I'm teasing you, but seriously, dude, that's bad. That's bad. Okay, Gnostics thought like spirit, matter, matter bad, flesh bad, spirit good. Okay, why are they presenting things like the physicality of Jesus, his resurrection appearances in Luke chapter 24, if he was like such a Gnostic and he's copying Gnostic stories? Second of all, like Marcion, like didn't he like get rid of a lot of this stuff? Um, and he was a Gnostic, and he basically mangled Luke's gospel to make it fit his theology, and so like dude, like you need to go back and study history. Like even if you like disagree with us, we're coming from like a Christian perspective, like just read other, just even main traditional scholars, even people that I would disagree with. They're not going to say that Luke was copying the Gnostic stories. It's totally the other way around, or at least if that. So no, stop, just
yeah,
stop.
yeah. We talked about how ridiculous the idea that Luke copied Josephus is. This proposal is so absurd that no one has ever, as far as I'm aware, no serious scholar has ever asserted that Luke copied from the Gnostic Gospels. Everyone agrees that it was written much earlier, and it's not remotely Gnostic in content. I have a feeling you don't know what that word means. You're just repeating something you heard. But I also want to address this other part, that the Quran copied none of the Gnostic false stories. Now, I know you're not an expert on the Quran, but do you happen to know offhand of an example of a story that comes from a Gnostic writing that the Quran copied?
Me off the top of my head.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I know he gets it really wrong with the whole Trinity thing, like Mary is part of the Trinity, which is kind of ridiculous. I know that there's the infancy. It seems like there's stuff about Jesus turning clay pigeons into birds was something
Mm-hmm.
that was taken from the apocryphal infancy gospel of Thomas, which is also, yeah, that's pretty bad. That's a big howler right there. So yeah, there's a lot of different things.
Yep. So the copying of the clay birds would be an example. That work might not technically be Gnostic, but it's same idea, written very late. Uh, the Jesus speaks from the cradle in the Quran. Jesus commands a palm tree to bow down and supply food for Mary in the Quran. The idea that Jesus wasn't crucified in the flesh.
That's from Gospel of Barnabas, right?
Yep, that comes from the Gnostic writings for sure. That's actually the one of the main tenets of Gnostic theology is that the divine Jesus is separate from the body. That the divine Jesus was not on the cross, and that's something the Quran copies. So there's many things that no historian of any repute whatsoever would say are historical. And the only person that would even try to argue that is someone who believes in the Quran. And even then, I'm not aware of any serious attempt to argue these things are historical. And you're asserting that the Quran copied none of these stories, and uh, all these stories come from somewhere else. That is true. I don't know. Um,
Well, he's so far so far. Like these are pretty bad.
yeah. And final comment from him for now, and then we'll move on with the presentation. Jesus comes from previous stories, myths, and folklore, which I find especially ironic since Muslims are supposed to believe in
Yeah.
Jesus. But just, in a couple sentences, just tell us where the Jesus mythicism stands in professional scholarship.
Oh, I mean, it's not something that anybody takes seriously, really. I mean, there's like, I mean, I can think of a couple guys, but they're just kind of jokes in the academy. I don't know, but it's their arguments are just so poor. I mean, that's why I was watching a debate the other day between Bob Price, a mythicist, and Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic New Testament scholar that we quoted earlier. And he said that like Paul didn't even write Galatians. He actually proposed that. And Bart was just like, "Are you serious right now? Are you saying that Paul didn't write Galatians?" He's like, "Yeah, I don't think Paul wrote it." He also said that like Paul never really converted. He was always a Christian. And Bart was like, "What?" And like people just started laughing. And he's like, Bob is a nice guy. Like he's like the nicest mythicist that I know. But they just Bart was just like, "Dude, that's laughable." And he's like, "Well, if that's laughable, then why are we?" I'm paraphrasing. "Why are we even debating this right now?" And it's just like, yeah, maybe you got a point there, Bob. Like, so
Well, I mean, actually, he's right. That's why the mythicists normally don't get debates, is because no one takes them remotely seriously. You know, like this
yeah,
position is so ridiculous, it's not even mentioned in secular classes about the history of how the New Testament came to be, because it's just so ridiculously stupid that no one of any credibility even considers it. Thus, they don't even discuss it, so they don't have debates. And then the mythicists say, "Well, you're running from us. You're afraid of our arguments." No, that's not it.
no, it's just so bad. And the problem is the reason why I don't advise people to normally, and I've talked to mythicists before. I'm friends with a guy who's a mythicist, and we discussed undesign coincidences actually on my channel. But um, yeah, it's just like no matter what you say to a mythicist, they can always stretch it like way like what like where did you come up with that? Kind of like with Bob Price saying that Paul was always a Christian. It's just like, well, Paul said I persecuted Christians. Well, he didn't actually write that. It's just like, okay, so
Well,
like nothing I can say is actually going to work as evidence for with you, because like you're just off in outer space somewhere with this stuff. So yeah.
all right, go ahead and continue with your presentation. I'll keep an eye on see if Red One says anything
Oh, okay.
useful. But
Yeah, we'll wrap up with this one. This is
okay, sounds good.
reconcilable variations, and so what a reconcilable variation refers to is when there exists two accounts of the same event, or at least two accounts that appear to cross over the same territory at some point. And at first blush, they may seem so divergent that it's almost awkward. But then you think about it for a little bit, and on further thought, they turn out to be very reconcilable in some kind of natural fashion. I'm not talking about forced harmonization, restrained harmonization at all. I'm just talking about using a little real world imagination. Okay. And so when two accounts appear at first to be so divergent that one is not sure that they can be reconciled, that is actually a significant evidence for their independence. And we kind of already touched on that with the fact that, like, Luke wasn't using Paul's letters because they seem to be so divergent that they're not, that they have to be independent. Yet at the same time, they're not like, you can't, you can reconcile them rather easily. Um, so for example, here's one from Bart Ehrman here. He says, Luke 24, Luke rises from the dead, and on that day he meets his disciples. And then again, on that day he ascends to heaven from the town of Bethany. But when you read Acts 1, written by the same author, you find that Jesus didn't ascend on that day or on that place. Jesus instead spends 40 days with his disciples, proving to them that he had been risen from the dead. And only then, after 40 days, does he ascend. So Luke tells us the same story twice in two radically different ways. Historical accuracy doesn't appear to be his concern. So, ouch, there's Bart taking a shot here. Well, I think if we actually, like, at first they do look like, okay, I don't understand what's going on, but they're pretty easily reconciled. If we actually just read Luke 24, we see clearly that's not what's going on, right? Two men urge Jesus to stay with them because it's already getting towards evening and the day's far spent. They recognize him in the breaking of bread at the evening meal, and then after he appears, they hurry back to Jerusalem. Luke notes that that's a 6 to 7 mile walk. This would have taken at least a couple hours. Then they tell their story while they're there. Jesus appears, he talks with them, he eats with them to illustrate that he's not a ghost. And then Jesus opens their minds to understand the scriptures and the prophecies concerning himself in verse 45. This probably would have been a pretty long Sunday evening sermon, because this isn't something that you probably would just go over in like 2 minutes. He's talking about all the different prophecies and how he fulfills the law. And then it says, only after that did they go to Bethany. Well, sundown in April, in that part of the world, is around 7 p.m. at that time, right? And so that's when we know that the crucifixion happened. And so it would have been dark for by the time they'd be walking back out. So they never even would have seen him ascend. And so we don't really know exactly why Luke rushed the ending. Maybe he was running out of scroll or something like that. I don't know. But he does clear things up in Acts chapter 1 where he says the ascension happened after 40 days. And so I don't really think that that's a very difficult one to think through. You could just read the markers in the text themselves. And I think that they're actually pretty easily, that he's not saying that everything just happened on one day and Jesus ascended. That's pretty obvious.
Yeah, but before you move on, I actually wanted to comment on that real quick.
Sure.
Here we have the same author,
Yeah.
writing two different things. And Ehrman says that, he doesn't, this is evidence that he didn't care about historical accuracy. Well, that's a really uncharitable assumption. The usual assumption would be an author doesn't contradict himself. Yeah. And this is important because, this is the same author. So if these were two different accounts and we provided that explanation that the one author was just giving a very brief explanation, wasn't intending to do the exact amount of time, and the other filled in more details, skeptics would say, you're just making stuff up. Yet, here we have an example of that, and the same author condensing his own account. And really, this is normal. If you're talking to a group of people who are already familiar with a story, you're probably not going to give a super long version of it. Or maybe you just don't have a lot of time at that particular day. Or in this case, you're almost out of space on the scroll and you're going to be writing a longer account. You just want to sum it up. Your purpose for writing is different. You report different details. And I think these contradiction things, when you're comparing two different authors, I can at least understand where it's coming from. When you say the same author contradicted himself, often like one verse right after the next, some of these things are so silly, then you're obviously misreading the text because the author didn't contradict himself. Especially if he's making stuff up, he's going to make sure that he is not contradicting himself.
Well, yeah, and if you just read the text for yourself and you see these indicators of time, it's pretty obvious he's just compressing the narrative. And there's nothing wrong. He's not even like changing the times necessarily. He's just simplifying it down. We do that in normal conversation all the time, where we don't just like say every little detail, that happened and all that other stuff. Like sometimes we just compress the whole thing down and get to the point. So do a couple more here. This is skeptic Matthew Harkey. He says that Mark's Jesus tells us that the disciples that he will meet with them in Galilee and does so in Matthew, but Luke's Jesus appears only in or around Jerusalem, and he actually tells the disciples not to leave the city. And so it seems to be a contradiction here. While it's plausible that Jesus' instruction to remain in Jerusalem was said to the disciples after they returned, it is plausible that Jesus' instruction to remain in Jerusalem was said to the disciples after they had returned to the Jerusalem area from Galilee during the 40 days on which Jesus remained on the earth, perhaps shortly or even immediately prior to the ascension. By all accounts, the ascension occurred from the region of the Mount of Olives, which is near Bethany, which Bethany is right by Jerusalem. So evidently they went to Galilee and then came back. It's not like something that's really that hard to think through, I think. One more, and this is the biggie, and I kind of touched on it earlier. In Galatians 1:16 through 20, Paul says, I didn't immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem, but to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia and then returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him for 15 days. I saw none other of the apostles except James, Lord's brother. I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. He's like really emphatic here. And Ehrman says that on all accounts, Acts seems to be at odds with Paul. Did he spend time with the other Christians immediately, which is what Acts says, or not, which is what Paul says? Does he go straight up to Jerusalem, which is what Acts says, or not, Paul? Did he meet with the group of apostles, Acts, or just with Peter and James, Paul? And so he's saying there's all these contradictions. Well, if you actually go back and read the text, it says that after many days had passed, and we already kind of touched on this earlier, the Jews plotted to kill him. but their plot became known to Saul, and they were watching the gates day and night to kill him. But the disciples led him by night and let him down through the opening of the wall through a basket. Well, in many days, there's a lot of things that can fit in many days. There's a passage in I believe it's First Kings 2, yeah, Second Kings 2, 38 through 39. It says, so Shimei lived in Jerusalem many days, but it happened at the end of 3 years. Well, many days apparently in one context, and I know it's Old Testament. I'm not saying just because it's in the Bible that works, but I'm just saying that like many days can absolutely include 3 years. But what about the trip to Arabia? Well, Luke is silent about it, but does Luke contradict Paul's claim that he went to Arabia? I'd put Paul's trip to Arabia within the many days of Acts 9:23. Paul also tells us that in Galatians 1:17 that he returned again to Damascus. So it isn't really surprising then that this subsequent trip to Jerusalem is actually from Damascus. And then also what's kind of interesting about this whole thing with Damascus is if Acts was written by somebody who had no access to the story of Paul's conversion, then why did he place it on the way to Damascus of all places? Damascus isn't even a city that features prominently in the rest of Acts. If Luke was using Galatians, he wouldn't have put Damascus into his story while leaving out Paul's trip to Arabia or the passing of 3 years. Either Luke is like carefully devious, as I've mentioned before, to include a small detail like Damascus while also being a major blunder at the same time, but leaving out the trip to Arabia. And so again, critics can't have it both ways. And so again, I think these are things that are easily reconcilable and actually kind of fit well together. In this particular case, with both of them mentioning Damascus, which is just kind of this obscure thing that doesn't really feature prominently in the rest of the narratives anywhere. And so it seems to me it's more rooted in truth than it is in what the skeptic would want to say here.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree that there's actually only maybe 5 things that are really proposed as serious errors that the Acts makes. This one and the census being the main 2 that are gone to. And, from an objective standpoint, a non-faith standpoint, even if the author is wrong about this point, that doesn't mean that he's unreliable. And I agree. I agree there is no real contradiction here. And the census, I think, is also very easily resolved. But even if there's an error, that's not how history's done, right? You don't go to a secular historian's writings and say, wow, he got 100 facts right and 1 wrong. We can't trust anything he says. Right. That's not how it works at all.
Well, the skeptic will want to say that, like, their few amount of errors and contradictions that they can pull out somehow carry the day. That's what Bart Ehrman really seems to think, that the amount of contradictions that he can come up between Paul's letters and Acts are enough to carry the day to just kind of throw out that he could have been a traveling companion of Paul. And it's just what is baffling to me about that is when it comes to eyewitness testimony, we do expect for there to be the occasional incongruity here and there, disagreements. That's actually a feature of what we would expect. And most of the time, these contradictions are just manufactured and based on tendacious readings and just kind of like what, that are pretty easily resolvable. But yeah, it's odd for people to think. I agree with you that minor errors made what seemed to be in good faith would somehow carry the day and make an entire document unreliable. But then these are the same people who want to say that all these other things that I brought out, those don't count. It's just like, what? It doesn't make any sense. So
yeah, I mean, it's kind of like you said earlier, heads I win, tails you lose type situation, where if Luke reported exactly the same words or at least the same ideas of what Paul reports in his letters, 100% chance that the skeptic would say that he's dependent on that writing, that he's copied from it. He says something different. You say, see, he says something different. He didn't know what the real Paul. I also find this particular instance especially ironic because by asserting that Paul is, telling 100% of what happened and that Luke is just making stuff up, what they're really asserting is that Paul actually had an encounter with the risen Lord Jesus, and he learned his theology from Jesus, because that's what Paul is asserting. That's his purpose of putting this in Galatians, is that I didn't learn this theology from men. I didn't go and talk with other people to determine what the correct theology was. I learned it from Jesus himself. That's his point. So if you're saying that he really didn't go and converse with any other disciples, and Luke made this up to redeem Paul and make him a true disciple who's teaching the same message or whatever, then you're really asserting that Paul miraculously got knowledge of the gospel, and he most certainly teaches the same gospel. Basically, always teaches. He might have different emphasis here and there on minor details about the story of Jesus, but he teaches the same thing. There's nothing that's incongruent with what he teaches, and you're asserting that he really did just get this from Jesus. So I find it really, really ironic.
Well, I mean, and they have to admit that even in the second chapter of Galatians, Paul presents his gospel to these guys, and it says that they gave him the right hand of fellowship, and so evidently they had no problem with anything that he was saying, and they approved it. And not only did they approve of it, they trusted him so much so that they actually were like, we're taking up these offerings for the poor saints in Jerusalem who are affected by this famine. Paul, here, take the money bag, collect the offerings, bring them to the poor saints in Jerusalem. So that's not only do they approve the message that he's actually preaching, but they entrust him with like a pretty big job and something that you don't normally trust people with, which is finances. There's all of these things taken together are just all point in the same direction. So, but yeah, that's basically the presentation. We made
Excellent.
our way through the whole thing. So,
all right, yep. So I have a couple miscellaneous questions that weren't
sure.
directly on topic that I'd get to, but real quick, since we mentioned the census a couple times, there are multiple different explanations for why Luke is putting the census where he did, and it looks like you have a slide on that, so I'll bring that back up.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I did happen to have that just in case. And so, yeah, what about the census? It says, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole world should be registered. That's the NIV, which I don't think is the best translation there. Caesar Augustus, the skeptical say, he never ordered the whole world, the whole Roman world, to be registered. But what the verse says actually is that the whole oikumene, which is the whole land, was to be registered. Luke uses this term and nearly the same construction in Acts 11:28 when he says that there was a famine across the whole land. So he's not talking about the whole Roman world. He's talking about a localized area that Luke uses the same word about later. Now he says that this was another skeptical complaint is that in Luke 2:2 it says this was taken. The first census was taken while Quirinius was still the governor of Syria. And the complaint is that Quirinius didn't become governor of Syria until 6 AD, 10 years after Herod the Great was dead. How can a chronological blunder of 10 to 12 years be explained? Well, this is just an uncharitable reading of the text. If you actually read Luke 1-5, Luke knows that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. So he knows when he was born, so it's not 10 or 12 years later. He also knows about the taxation of Quirinius in AD 6 because it's mentioned in Acts 5:37. So any explanation of Luke's language in Luke 2:1-2 absolutely has to be compatible with these facts. Now, scholars have suggested the translation of the passage is incorrect. There's a lot of different ways that you can explain this. I did a live stream with Tim McGrew and some others, friends of mine on the channel Exploring Reality. If you want to search that, we go through a different hypotheses on that. But this is N.T. Wright. He basically argues that the word, there's cat again, translated as first in Luke 2:2 should actually be translated as before in this context. It follows that if Luke was saying Jesus was born before the famous census taken under Quirinius, then there would absolutely be no conflict between Luke and Josephus whatsoever. Now, the census of Judea may have begun, and this is another proposal, during Herod's reign when Jesus was born, but not been completed until Quirinius' reign in 6 AD. The reading would be this enrollment was first completed, i.e. used, when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Due to this, the census became associated with Quirinius' name, which explains why Luke refers to it the way that he does. The political complexities in Judah during this time and Jewish resistance to Roman taxation provide us with plenty of reasons to think why the census may have been stalled or interrupted so as to stretch over many years. According to the classical historian Paul Meyer, it actually took 40 years to conduct a census in Gaul around the same time. So it could be uh, it could be so it could well be, that a count was made or begun in Judea before the death of Herod. Quirinius, as you can tell, I don't have this one off the top of my head. Quirinius may have only made use of it to collect tax in 6 AD when he came up to clean up Archelaus' mess. Now, that's another proposal. But this is Lydia McGrew. I'm just going to quote her a little bit at length here. The whole idea that Luke made up a census or moved Jesus' birth too much later is absurd. It's the same thing as using a steamroller to crack a nut. All Luke had to do if he wanted to make Jesus be born in Bethlehem, because that's why people say, oh, he made up the census to get Jesus in Bethlehem. All he had to do if he wanted to make Jesus be born in Bethlehem, contrary to the fact, was to have Mary and Joseph start out in Bethlehem and later travel to Nazareth. There was no need for him to invent the idea that Mary was from Nazareth and that they had to travel back from there while she was pregnant down to Bethlehem and then back to Nazareth, and then invent a Roman census for such a purpose would be a wildly exaggerated plot device. Luke's deliberately connecting it falsely with Quirinius and placing it at a date that is in tension with all of Luke's own other date indicators is also very overwhelmingly implausible. Why would he do such a thing like that? Luke didn't have to mention Quirinius at all if he was inventing a census out of thin air. And so I think overall, it's probably the most common objection. It does have some force because of the reading and because of the fact that there is just so many different interpretations. But I think, again, Luke clearly knows when Jesus was born. And if you even go to Luke 3:1, it talks about when John the Baptist's ministry, when that began to happen and who he lists off as the rulers there, they're all clearly in line with all the other correct timelines. And so, I think it's more of a manufactured historical error than an actual real one, for sure.
Yeah, I love Lydia. That quote you got there is great. That the idea that he invented a census to have Mary traveling when he could have just asserted that that's where she was is rather ridiculous. Because obviously the idea being that, well, Jesus grew up in Nazareth, so you need to invent a story of how he could have been born in Bethlehem, even though everyone knows he's born in Nazareth. But all you have to say is they lived there when he was born, and then they moved to Nazareth. It's not that complicated. You don't need to invent this wild story.
Exactly.
And I'm a fan of the before explanation myself. That
me too.
Luke is pointing out he's knows that his audience is familiar with this very famous census, which became a major political catastrophe for Rome, became the reason that one of the main reasons that led to the Jewish rebellion. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, not that one, the one before that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the view I favor. There's other views. There's even the fact, I think Inspiring Philosophy did a video where he's just like, actually, I just think Luke got it right and Josephus got it wrong. And he cites a paper by a scholar who argues that on a number of different grounds. It's a pretty dense video, but it is definitely worth checking out. And that's possible too. I think sometimes skeptics treat Josephus like he's divinely inspired. And so anytime there's a contradiction between the Gospels and Josephus, it's always Josephus who is right. You can't possibly consider that, maybe like Josephus got some facts wrong here and there.
Yeah, definitely. The skeptic will say, well, Josephus, it's very unlikely that Josephus got such an important date wrong. Well, it's very unlikely that Luke got it wrong a priori too. So maybe you need another argument other than Josephus probably got it right.
Yeah, exactly. So.
All right. So this is what I alluded to earlier from Sajid Tanver. The fact the early church purposely got rid of many gospels just shows Christianity can never be trusted. It's more like a Greek theater production. So obviously the topic wasn't the formation of the canon,
Mhm.
but do you have anything that you would like to talk about with the formation of the canon?
With the formation of the canon, I mean,
Or just, the nature of the works that were discarded.
yeah, I mean, if you look at the nature of the works that are discarded, they're ridiculous. I mean, we have all these indicators, particularly, I hope, by the 2 hours we've spent so far, that show that these people were from the time that they were saying these events happened, that they were aware of the times and places and customs and beliefs and all of these different details, and they interlock with each other in ways that are casual and subtle, that seem to be based more on what would be eyewitness testimony than just making things up or embellishing things. If you want to go ahead and run a comparison, I mean, like for example, like read the Gospel of Thomas. It's just a bunch of weird esoteric sayings of Jesus. Some ripped off from the Gospels, rather obviously, and some are just like, completely don't sound like the rest of the character of Jesus that we have. Um, or they're like, you have the Gospel of Judas where he's just talking to Jesus and people from outer space, apparently. I mean, you have all these weird names and different things like that. Or you see like obvious embellishments. This isn't necessarily a Gnostic text, but like the Gospel of Peter, where it's just like you have talking crosses coming out of empty tombs and all kinds of like exaggerated weirdness that don't show the kind of restraint, or different things that we talk about, or reporting embarrassing details, which we didn't talk about, but we could, I suppose. But and so I mean, there's just no comparison. I mean, these things look way more rooted in realistic eyewitness testimony. There's also the fact that um, these gospels were passed down to people who succeeded the apostles. I mean, we know that they appointed different people to run the church. They had spiritual sons who they appointed in different places, and they were on high alert in terms of like what is good and what is real and what goes back to the apostles and what is just a bunch of heretical garbage. And they were pretty, they could detect these things. And so it's just kind of acting like anybody could just kind of write a gospel. Uh, and what the irony too about people complaining about the gospels being anonymous, so you can't trust them, is that none of the apocryphal gospels are anonymous. They all say, "Oh, Thomas, I'm Thomas. I wrote this. I'm Judas. I wrote this. I'm Mary. I wrote this. I'm Peter. I wrote this." But then they have all this flaky, crazy stuff on the inside of them that don't have the comparison could not be more stark, in a nutshell. And so if they did, they didn't just like throw these away in some big pile and burn the heretics and chase them around or whatever, or persecute them. It was they were able to distinguish these things well before. If you go to like ntcanon.org and you click on table, it's kind of an interesting little place. And you look, like the Gospel of Thomas is not cited by Ignatius, Polycarp, or even Marcion for that matter, Irenaeus, Clement, Tertullian, the Muratorian Canon. Origen mentions it and he says that it's garbage. Eusebius mentions and he says that it's garbage. Okay, and then you look at all of these other gospels: Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of the 12, Acts of Paul and Thecla, all of these different other writings. They didn't receive these because from the very beginning, from early, we don't see Ignatius or Polycarp or Justin Martyr even quoting these particular works as anything. The only time that we see some people kind of halfway open to it is Clement of Alexandria. Like he quotes the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Gospel of the Hebrews. But if I remember correctly, and there's a book, I'm trying to remember the name of the scholar. It's really going to bother me. Charles Hill, who chose the Gospels, I think he about faces and says, oh, okay, wait a minute, I was wrong about those. And so now I'm not 100% sure. My memory might be not, failing me right now. But that is a good book if somebody wants to research this topic more. Charles Hill, who chose the Gospels.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said is accurate. I'll just put it slightly simpler. Um, that we have objective standards. We can look at, you're saying they contain all these weird things, and that's not just your opinion. That's an objective fact, that they don't meet any of the standards of historical reliability. And we have evidence of what the church looked for. They did consider the theology of the work, but they also considered the authorship. They considered its history. They considered a bunch of things, and the gist of it is they got it right. Every historian, every New Testament scholar, atheist, agnostic, whatever, will agree that the four Gospels that made the canon are certainly the first four written. They're the only four that have any basis in history other than the small portions of the other gospels in quotes, that were copied from them. Likewise with the pseudographical letters and Acts of Paul and all these other things. Many of them are orthodox in theology. They're not all heretical. Many of them have orthodox theology, but the church rejected them anyway because they weren't authentic. They didn't believe they were authentic, and they were right. We can look back, and everyone agrees that all of these things were written later.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Gospel of Thomas, and that's the best of them all. And that's the most credible of any of these secondary sources. And still, there's basically no one who thinks it was written contemporarily with the Gospels.
Yeah, it's a sayings gospel, and most scholars will agree that they're borrowing from the Gospels. Because there definitely is a lot of overlap with the sayings of Jesus and the sayings of the Gospels, but virtually nobody's saying Thomas came first. There's not like any Thomas priority theorists. So yeah,
exactly. So Red One's been making a bunch of stupid statements, but I asked him many times. He just kept asserting, "My evidence is the Quran," and I say, "What's your evidence that the Quran's correct?" "My evidence is the Quran," that kind of thing. But he did ask this question, probably not all that genuinely, but I think it's beneficial to ask anyway. Who is the eyewitnesses for Jesus Christ? So just in your estimation, or you can go through and count them, how many valid historical sources do we have for the person of Jesus?
Oh, I don't really like using like Josephus or Tacitus or different things like that to prove the historical Jesus, because all it shows is that they had knowledge of what Christians believed. I think they're somewhat helpful, but in a very, very limited degree, and they're not really like dependent. I mean, I just think let's just man up and defend the four Gospels because they're good documents. You want an eyewitness for Jesus Christ? Well, the Apostle John claims to be an eyewitness, and there are many, many, many very interesting arguments and evidence for the reliability of the Gospel of John. I mentioned Lydia McGrew already. She's written a book called Eye of the Beholder. If you don't want to go buy the book, just watch one of the many YouTuber interviews that she's done or podcast interviews that she's done on that topic. I think if you like this kind of evidence for Acts, you can find very similar evidence with the Gospel of John. I think I'm going to go against what a lot of people think, but I think Matthew wrote Matthew. That's a whole other stream. But and then we know that Mark was a interpreter through the early church fathers. He was an interpreter for the Apostle Peter. Papias tells us that he was writing down basically what St. Peter was preaching, the Apostle Peter was preaching. And so he's deriving his gospel from probably one of the best eyewitnesses you could possibly get. And then we know that Luke used Mark's gospel, and Luke traveled around with Paul. He had his own materials that we've mentioned, and he would have been able to interview different people. We don't have the names. He doesn't name his sources necessarily. But yeah, I think there's ample evidence to trust Luke, considering how meticulous of a historian he's shown himself to be, and what I've hopefully argued for in this stream.
Excellent. So we have Pavel D., who I'm assuming is a skeptic, just like the Christians. What's the evidence for Christianity? the Bible.
Yeah. So
This is just,
the apologia jingle right there, the for the Bible
yeah,
tells me
exactly.
so. Yeah. Well, we're not arguing like God said it, therefore I believe it. It's inspired. We're saying let's look at the Gospels. Let's see what are their authors like. What is their relationship to truth? Were they in a position to know what they were talking about? We're just looking at them like we would look at other historical documents. The only thing that we're not doing is we're not taking miracles off the table from the outset. And so I would want to know why we should do that.
Yeah, I mean, this statement's equivalent of what saying something like, "What's your evidence for Julius Caesar? Tacitus? Oh, you can't just go to Tacitus and assume that he's telling the truth."
Yeah.
Well, we're not assuming a priori that the Bible is correct, which is what your assertion is. Whether you realize that or not, that's really the assertion you're making, is that we are just declaring that the Bible is correct, therefore Christianity is true, and that's not remotely the argument we've made.
Yeah. This isn't
There might be people who make
presuppositional.
that, but it's not our argument.
Yeah. This isn't presuppositional apologetics here. I mean, even which that's probably a slam on precepts that they wouldn't take and they shouldn't take. But I'm not just assuming from the outset like this is the Bible. It's inspired. It's God's word, and so therefore, I have to start this to even reason itself. Like, no, we're talking about public evidence that's available to everybody that they can honestly examine, and yeah.
Yeah, and we're just treating, at least when I'm making an argument, I'm treating the biblical text the same I would treat any other historical text. I don't assume it's right, but I don't assume it's wrong either. And the skeptic generally just wants to dismiss it a priori. They want to just say the Bible can't be trusted because it's a theological work, therefore you have no evidence. Well, yeah, if you dismiss all the evidence, or at least the majority of the evidence, before you investigate it, then of course there's no evidence, but that's not a valid argument. And think about this. If Christianity was true, would you expect people who wrote about it to not become Christians? Would you expect someone, which is what I feel like people want. They want eyewitness testimony that Jesus rose from the dead from someone who isn't a Christian. It's like, what? If you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, you're going to be a Christian. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you're unreliable. It just means that you saw what happened and it changed your life.
Yeah, Holocaust survivors are biased for their cause, but it's for a good reason. It doesn't mean we just assume that, like, well, you're just, trying to stump for your particular cause. I mean, that'd be a horrible thing to do. We think that they're biased in favor of what they're saying, but that doesn't mean that we don't think that they could be accurate reporters. We think that their bias could actually probably drive them to be even more honest because they want to get the facts out to people.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of interested objective history is a 19th or 20th century invention. It's not something you find in any ancient history work, regardless of who wrote it. And historians don't have a problem using any other source. And actually, historians generally don't, like actual historians who aren't involved in biblical scholarship, don't necessarily have a problem treating the say Book of Acts that we're discussing today as a valid source. They just don't assume it's automatically true.
Yeah.
But then you get skeptics who don't have the slightest clue how history is done, and they say, see, you're just assuming that text's true, and that's not what we're assuming at all.
No.
Two more comments. Redawan says, they all forsook him, meaning Jesus, and fled, no disciples as witnesses.
Well, yeah, John actually comes back because he was able to report that Jesus was pierced in his side. And so he obviously, they fled while he was being arrested. It doesn't mean that they couldn't have come near the scene later. And so I guess he's trying to say like Jesus wasn't really crucified. That's kind of ridiculous. We know that the women were there. We know that they were also with John during the time of the crucifixion. Jesus says to Mary, behold thy son, thy son, and he puts John basically in Mary's care. So, um, yeah, no, that doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just say, yes, they did forsake him and flee. And then something happened, and they all believed that he rose from the dead. And all, at least according to tradition, some of the evidence is not rock solid, but some of it is rock solid. They went to death, proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. So something happened. You need an explanation for what happened.
Well, and I mean, let's just think that, like, on his hypothesis, if he's coming at this as a Muslim, is basically Allah deceived a bunch of people into thinking that Jesus was really crucified when he really wasn't, and he started the world's largest false religion. So, if that's the kind of God you want to worship, Redwan, then go ahead. That seems kind of silly to me, but do your thing,
Yeah, I
bro.
mean, I agree that the Quran explicitly, he's insisting the Quran's his story. The Quran explicitly insists that Allah made the Christians uppermost. So he purposely made the Christians who have this false perception of Jesus being crucified and rising from the dead. He purposely made them uppermost, and then he waited 700 years to come around and say, oh, by the way, you guys are all wrong. Yeah, it really makes a lot of sense, especially since if you look at what the Quran actually says and what early Muslims actually said, they didn't actually believe this either. This is a more modern invention to get around the fact that the Gospels contradict Islam. The Quran itself asserts that it teaches the same message. The author just didn't know what he was talking about in reality.
Yeah.
Last statement here, because I think this kind of sums things up well. Veronica at the wall. History and archaeology can't prove the Bible is always right, but they support it, certainly. And that's what our argument really is here, is that, we're not saying any piece of evidence is 100% proof. That's not something that exists in history. It's not something that even exists in a court of law or in science, for that matter. You look at the preponderance of evidence, and that's how you decide truth in all things other than pure logic.
Right.
Anything you want to add?
No, again, this tells us what the authors are like. If they were trying to get it right more often than not, and they do get it right more often than not, and we can see it through all these different markers that are in here. Yeah, I just think that we have plenty of evidence for the honest, unembellished nature of the Gospels through all of these different things: geography, small details of culture, all these other tiny details, like I mentioned with Kata, that you just can't look up. All these different internal evidences, like the undesigned coincidences, the unified personalities that we see. And so, if they're that reliable, then I think the best explanation is that they didn't make things up. They were careful what to include. They were in a position of either actual eyewitnesses or very close. It looks like what they recorded was originally claimed by the witnesses about Jesus' resurrection. And what I'm saying is that this is a unified view, and it just explains the evidence a whole lot better than a disunified view, where the authors were getting all of these things right, showing all these signs of truthful testimony, but then suddenly Jekyll and hiding it, and considering themselves free to invent and change facts. I don't think that explains it very well. And so that sums it up pretty much right there.
Yeah, I like to think of the skeptics' theory generally is that the authors of the New Testament were very smart and also very stupid, because
Yeah.
they say that they got some basic facts wrong, so we know that they're not reliable, but they're very smart because they took all of these subtle things and twisted them all together in such a way to deceive you. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. The luck
All right.
hypothesis doesn't fit either. So, well, cool, man. Well, Thaddeus, I really appreciate you having me on.
Yep. Thank you very much for coming on. I think this was a really great stream. I hope people get a lot of benefit out of it. Oh, and by the way, I did interview Lydia McGrew on her book about John. So if you are interested in that, you can check out my interview with her on this channel. Thank you all for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to Testify if you haven't already done so. The link is in the description box. I'll add a link to the pinned comment as well, because he's doing amazing work. Obviously my ministry is focused on outreach to Muslims, but if it was focused on straight apologetics, it'd be right at the top of my recommended list. So thank you for joining us. Have a great day. God bless.